So ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Embassy of Finland and welcome back to live conferences in Embassy of Finland. It's great to have you here. This one is Julia from Atlantic Council and she will co-MC with me today.
Hi everybody, welcome to today's event. We're looking forward to a great lineup. I think I'm going to pass it back to Antti so we can kind of jump in and get started.
So first, it gives me great pleasure to welcome Ambassador of Finland to the United States, His Excellency Mikko Hautala, to give welcome remarks.
Good morning, dear friends. I'm not going to tell you yet what this is, but there's an explanation for everything. Antti already said welcome to the Embassy of Finland, so I can't repeat his phrase. I say that welcome to the Embassy of the happiest nation on earth. And also, it happens to be the most forested country in Europe. It happens to be a home to the fastest supercomputer in Europe. And a couple of weeks ago, Finland also joined the ranks of those roughly 10 countries globally that have a quantum computer up and running. So that's the combination, that's the host embassy you are in now. So it's a great pleasure to see you all here. As Antti said, gathered in a live event. I think we have all had our share of Zooms and Teams and all those things, so it gives me a great pleasure to see you in person. We have been working hard for this conference seminar with our friends in GeoTech Center of the Atlantic Council. We have a full-day program here, and of course we also welcome those viewing this online or watching the recording of this flagship event. We also very much appreciate our partners at Finnish company Nokia and thank them for making this conference possible. So we have today, shortly after me, the launch of the report that will sort of tries to unpack the geopolitics of technology. So we have, I would say, raised the bar really high, unpack the geopolitics of technology. And of course, then in the afternoon, we are also trying to find some ways to tackle the challenges that this situation gives us. We have a fascinating set of unique features on site, distinguishing today's conference from the remote video meetings that we have now experienced. There are also, as I said, in the afternoon, some expert-led working groups. I have to also announce that, since you know, there is a Summit for Democracy going on in this town tomorrow, and this event is a side event to that great meeting. So it's our portion in the side events. And because there's a link to this Summit for Democracy, I'm also happy to announce that the President of the Republic of Finland has given his video greeting to us. So now we will listen to that. Please play the video.
Ladies and gentlemen, once again, technology is transforming the world. New technologies are rapidly changing the way our societies function. They are also changing the way nations interact with each other. This is why technologies are now at the heart of international relations and international security. Emerging technologies can be used to enhance peace and security, but they can also create previously unimaginable risks. As democratic nations, we should work together to make sure that technology works for our common good. To drive this debate, Finland has contributed to the independent report published today, Unpacking the Geopolitics of Technology. I wish you all a productive conference today, and I look forward to hearing about its outcomes.
Thank you, and I used to work directly for him 4.5 years, and I think that the final sentence he said, that I'm looking forward to hearing from the outcomes, means that he expects some results from this work. So that's not the end of the story. So I have to be able to report to him that something productive, something useful, something which gives us all some practical tools are expected. So that's the tasking. I already showed you this mystical thing. It's a time capsule. So and the proposal is that we will actually put some items or gadgets from today's world, and we will put it to the time capsule. And hereby I promise that we will open this time capsule 8th of December, I think I have to say 2046, exactly on the day when I'm going to go to pension. So I'm going to come back, I'm going to be here on my last day, and we will open it and see what it contains. My own personal contribution is this kind of battery, charging battery for iPhones. It's a nice Helsinki Metro chart on it. So that's my contribution, and we of course welcome some other contributions after this. And I hope that all of you are around in 2046 when we reopen it, and hopefully we can also then conclude that all those challenges, dangers, the President also mentioned, have been tackled, and this conference we had some contribution to that. Okay, Chris, would you like to hold this baby? Okay. Yes. So, in the end, I would also like to thank some other partners we've had. I mentioned already Nokia. Then there's a Vario Corporation, which deals with virtual reality. Then Smithsonian Museum of Arts and Industry, and George Washington University Debate and Literary Society. They're also going to be part of this exercise with us. I'm certain that this conference will once again underscore that Finland is committed in leading human-centric and principles-based technological development from the front. And we are a technology-driven economy with many companies in leading in emerging technologies. We are also, as always, practically minded and committed to transparency and robust discussion. An independent report launched next showcases this commitment. As a government, we might not agree with some of the colorful scenarios presented. However, we do believe that this report takes the discussion forward. That is the reason you are all, and we are all here today. Thank you, and I wish you a fruitful and interesting conference. Thanks.
So before moving to the report launch, just a quick note that the time capsule is on the table on my right-hand side, and there is a side table where you can leave your contributions. You can also write notes, these kind of notes which are on paper, which will survive the 25 years. And my contribution is this wearable electronics from 20 years past. It's Polar, one of the first companies, Finnish company in the world, which made wearables possible. Of course, now my Finnish ring can give me much more data than this back then. So now we move to the exciting event of the report launch on geopolitics and technology. And for those who are a little bit concerned that we have, people with high seniority, sorry, Julian, and gentlemen with high seniority talking about the future of technology, please don't be worried. As Ambassador mentioned, we have contributions then from George Washington University debate team following up this discussion on stage. And I think we have some of the students from George Washington University here, so if you could stand up. Oh, you are all on the back row. You have to come here in the front. So without further ado, I would like to throw the ball to Julian and Matt to introduce these, let's say, very interesting scenarios for the future of geopolitics and technology, which in certain sense seem a little bit miserable from the perspective of the future generations. And of course, with the QR code, what you have around in here, you can get to the site where you can also download the report. But if Julian and Matt, you can move forward with that, and then the Finnish Matt, so Matti Antonen, the permanent Secretary of State of Finnish Foreign Affairs, will then continue discussion with them. So please, Julian and Matt.
I think I'm going to begin, but I wanted to first say a big thank you to the Finnish Embassy, to the ambassador, and also to the opportunity to really work with a team in Helsinki on this report. I should emphasize we had 4 co-authors and 2 based in Helsinki, and they were Kaisa Åkesson and Ossi Pironen, and I think they're joining us by video. But they were far younger than I am, so we had more youthful, along with Julian. So I was the outsider here, both as more senior, but also as the only American involved in it. But we had a great time, and actually I think our views converged a lot. Now, this is a strategic foresight document, which means you're looking forward and you're trying to help the policymaker thinking particularly about the risks. There's less in this document on the opportunities, but we wanted to think about where are the challenges here in this new technological world. And we had 4 different areas here. And I'll get to the scenarios after, but I want to lay a groundwork here. First, looking at the future of work and how technology is transforming it, but also what are the challenges for workers in this new technological age. And we've seen this as an ongoing issue, really, of a lot of people, particularly those with less skills, being very fearful of technology and actually paying the price for the technological progress, in that they see their jobs go away and they have very hard time actually getting back in to the workforce. The second issue was looking at democracy. And actually this is, there was lots of hope at the beginning on the internet that this was going to open up everybody's mind. We were going to understand how others thought. It was going to enrich our own. And what we have seen instead with a lot of the IT as it is reinforced our own biases and prejudice, where we're not looking out beyond trying to engage with those who are not the like-minded, and in some sense with the first trend on future work, undermine basically our democracies. The third is looking at U.S.-China rivalry, what stresses this puts on technology, and also puts, and this is the fourth issue, puts Europe in a bind, particularly if we're headed towards a new Cold War with China. So those are the 4 kind of underlying trends. There are 3 scenarios, and first one is called post-pandemic letdown and Western disarray. And this is where, we may be already into this. We've seen a burst of economic activity after what we thought was going to be the end of the pandemic. It's not clear that we're ever going to get completely out of the pandemic. But over time, that kind of burst dissipates, and we get back to some of the same trend lines that we saw before, which was, as I was saying, on the particularly this automation, the fact that we don't really do retraining very well. And in this scenario, although it seems very bleak, by the end of the scenario, and this is what has happened with all technology revolutions, society begins to adapt. And in this scenario, you have the beginnings of a reinforced social model. So a much better social safety net, and also much more, I'd say, adapted education system to the technology age. So that means also lifelong learning and training. And that helps basically society begin to heal itself from what has been a lot of fraying that has been caused by the technology revolution. So the second scenario looks at Europe, particularly in this, what is emerging as a more bipolar world, so getting away from globalization into a much more bipolar world. This presents huge challenges for Europe. Now, the transatlantic ties very close, but you have European countries who are very dependent on trade and investment with China. In this scenario, U.S. moves to try to get its allies to curb those economic relations with China. You have some European countries that, because they want to keep the U.S. involved, particularly in the struggle with Russia, that they are willing to go along with these restrictions. Others in which their economies are much more linked to China, this presents a huge challenge. This one is probably not the happiest one, because it ends kind of like what we saw with the Iraq War, where Europe really splits. The third one is looking at the balkanization of the cyber space. And this is where you see a lot more, and we've seen this already, some regionalization. But this has more of I would say, more glimmers of hope, because in this scenario, basically on climate change, you're having everybody has to get together. And we have, in the end of the scenario, basically, that you have Europe trying to pull U.S. and China together using quantum computing. So this is a scenario right for Finland on using that quantum computing to really understand what's happening with climate and weather. And that helping with then thinking about how you battle climate change. So with that, I will turn it over to Julian, who can dig deeper into some of those trend lines and scenarios.
Well, thank you very much, Matt. And ever since we started working together, we've been at so many events where it's always, the accusation of painting a too bleak picture. And we've obviously talked about this so many times. And I don't want to turn into a pessimist myself. But I think doing strategic foresight, as Matt has said, is really about warning about the risks and indicating that the decisions that you make today to prevent certain risks from happening, this is what strategic planning, strategic foresight is all about. So obviously the risks in that sense are better to write in a report, because you don't want to be wrong about them, rather point a more negative picture than the reality is turning out to be, and we certainly hope for that. So maybe that as a quick preface. Matt kind of walked us a little bit through the report, but allow me to dig in a bit more deeper into some of the issues, particularly since the ambassador has mentioned it. We are in a week where the United States is convening a democracy summit. The pure fact that this is necessary says something about the status of democracies at this time in the beginning of the 21st century. And what the report really does, it merges two effects that we have witnessed over the last decades. It starts with looking at a degradation of what it means to be middle class in Western societies. Those are effects mostly derived from the last transition that we have seen, so from a production-based economy to a service-based economy. You see a agglomeration of economic activity. The statistic that I always like to cite for the United States is that Biden won 509 counties out of 3,000 roughly, and those 509 counties, so 1/6 of the nation's counties, stand for 71% of American GDP. And that's a trend that has been accumulating over the years. Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump in 2016 was a similar kind of economic balance, but it shows you that the hubs of growth mostly have moved to cities where service industry is located, and the production sites such as the Rust Belt have seen economic decline. And this is not obviously sharing secrets, but very well known research has been done about that. And we're asking the questions, well, what happens if we're going to see the next industrial revolution, if we see the automation not just of production lines and dark factories, but of service jobs, such as in supermarket shops or in fast food restaurants. And that transition is already underway. And if we're looking at the socio-economic implications of the last transitions and connected to the rise of populism, which we argue is mostly based on the assumption that people have lost faith in the problem-solving capacity of democratic institutions, which they do if their economic circumstances are threatened in that sense. And then connected also to the opportunities of mis and disinformation in the digital age. We cite data from the VDEM project that says, whenever the literacy, and that's more of the global scale, whenever the literacy, the digital literacy of the regime is more
higher,
sophisticated than the population, you'll see them using it for oppression, and if it's the other way around, it's the example of the Arab Spring. But particularly combined with those economic forces, obviously you have filter bubbles, you have propaganda, so on and so forth, and that's how you end up in a situation where liberal democracies are not just challenged by authoritarian counterparts in the world, but also by forces from within. And this is why the subtitle of the report is evaluating the second and third order implications of emerging technology. So it's not just about who has the biggest AI capabilities, who is most skilled in collecting data, but which system is most resilient to potentially deal with the economic and social implications of the next industrial revolution. And we, as Matt said, the second part of the report sort of digs into how each region of the world, the three main players, so the United States, China, and Europe, sort of handle that. Biden's infrastructure bill and its social spending bill is particularly focused in enabling people access to the middle class again. Europe obviously is very much concerned about regulating some of those big tech companies, while China sees AI, emerging technologies, as sort of their way to shine in the international system and set the rules of the road. They look at the United States and see the computing revolution as kind of their way to manifest its position, and in that sense see the opportunity to do that for themselves. Now we've done a similar project that we based some of the research on, that was on evaluating China's role as a global citizen and how the country uses artificial intelligence in that sense. And it's all about geopolitics these days, both in the second and third order implications. And the scenarios then obviously, as Matt has alluded to, highlight some of those geopolitical implications of what it means that with this resentment, with the threat to liberal democracy, has come about a criticism of globalization. And you see techno-nationalism, you see a decoupling, which obviously is particularly challenging for European economies. I myself, as Matt said, I'm German. Every second German car these days is sold in China. So you see the economic dependency that can be leveraged from both sides. And since the world has been so globalized, so interdependent, a sort of decoupling both in the economic as well as in the digital sphere will come not without consequences, and those consequences are played out in the scenario. So I'll leave it at that and look forward to the conversation with you, but thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you. Let's give a hand. Thank you, Matt and Julian. First of all, from my side, big thanks for the possibility of being here. This was my workplace for 4.5 years, early 2000s, and I enjoyed every minute of it. A good report. I had the opportunity to read it, 2 drafts, and then the final version. It got better, as things do get better when they are refined. I think what was said by our president is very important, especially from a kind of foreign policy practitioner's point of view, that technology is becoming more and more important, forming the world around us, how countries do interact, and what kind of processes we do have around. And technology policy is one thing, but I think what the countries would really need is kind of a data policy. How data is kind of being collected, used, refined, and so on. So I think that is an important thing which I got from this report. But first thing I would like to ask you is that how good are we in foreseeing technological change? Because I remember I was a young diplomat, and it was my first trip to China in 1989, and I visited the world's last factory making steam engines for railroads, which have closed in 1988. If somebody would have said then that the combustion engine is totally doomed in 50 years, I think many people would have doubted it. Now we know that that's going to happen, especially when it comes to light vehicles. But how good are we at foresight and seeing things in technology?
Well, I'll just take a stab at this. As some of you may have noted in my bio, I used to be working at the National Intelligence Council, and we did global trends looking at 15, 20 years. And I would say that, and we dealt a lot with Silicon Valley, so in trying to work with them thinking about this question of where the technologies were headed. I would say in a time frame of 5 to 10 years, we're pretty good at thinking about the technologies. Where we have a problem, even at that time scale, and I can give an example of this, this is what's happening in this technology revolution, is we should be actually calling it technology revolutions, because you have quite rapid acceleration of different technologies, and one of the reasons is that they are interacting. So, a lot of how the biotech revolution depends a lot on using the principles of 3D printing, using also the computational revolution, talking about the bigger and bigger computers. So that when you get into how things begin to interact, that's where we have a problem even in the shorter time frames. And the example I would give is if you look at the 2008 global trends, there's very little about fracking. I mean, these are actually pretty not new technologies. But they were combined in such a way, and then you also had an entrepreneurial culture that saw the advantages, smaller actually oil companies and gas companies that moved into this area, and that was very hard for us to pick out even 5, 10 years before it really came on the scene in a big way. So I think that is a really difficult, the interaction. The other thing that is difficult is the second and third order effects, and that's actually where Silicon Valley is not very good on. if you talk to them, they tend to have a bias towards everything is going to have a positive outcome with technology. And obviously, being in that industry, that would be, I think you do have to be very optimistic about your where it's going to be headed, but we have to be, I think, at this point, realistic that there were some negative and unanticipated social, political, geopolitical issues. And that's what we have to also deal with in order to ensure we have continued progress.
Yeah, maybe just to add to this, there's all sorts of stories and narratives around, those doomsday investors. The New Yorker had a great piece about, people preparing for the apocalypse and so on and so forth, and that's obviously, it seems to be part of our thinking. But what I find so fascinating is when we highlight this in the report, part of Biden's agenda, for instance, to meet climate objectives is based on technologies that have not been, they mostly have been invented, but they're not yet ready for large-scale use. So obviously it's always a bet on the future in some way. And what foresight in that sense is contributing to that debate, as Matt alluded to, is to think also about, other effects. Like the way that the people reads might, think that we are against globalization or against automation. Not at all. Living in a society where robots do our jobs would be, dream come true. But how are we dealing with, so to say, the trickle-down effects? And we have a case study in the report on trucking, for instance, right? I mean, wouldn't it be nice if people don't have to be on the road driving, being away from their families, and we have self-driving trucks on the road? Absolutely. But trucking is the largest occupation in more than 25 American states. So how do you deal with replacement? The Luddites in the UK, it was horrible work 100 years ago, but it was providing people with an economic income. And so, technological advancement might progress humankind overall. Obviously, we live longer, we're healthier, eat better, hopefully. But it also comes with negative externalities. And if those negative externalities are not being taken care of, are not addressed on a societal level, you see threats evolving to the system itself. Think about the way that we structure our economy, tax incentives, for instance. You give tax incentives to companies because the original idea was if they move production lines, you hire people, you pay them, they distribute wealth, they consume, they send their kids to school. If you have dark factories where very few people are working, the entire economic model around incentivizing companies to come might have changed in the first place. And this is what is important to think about from a social and a societal perspective and a geopolitical perspective down the road. So yes, technology changes for sure, but let's be aware of the social implications from that.
The second scenario paints rather grim picture of Europe. Coming from there, it doesn't look so bad. But there are kind of interesting questions for Europe, because we see this technological competition between United States and China. I think that's clear. On the other hand, then US spends something like 2.8% of its GDP on research and development, and in Europe it's about 2.2. So we are not so far from each other. Of course, in certain sectors we are further away. At the same time, I myself think that one of the strengths of Europe is exactly its diversity, different languages, the way we are compiled of 27 nations. I have a good example, for example, when I'm talking to my Portuguese friends. For them, Africa is very close. For them, to go to African markets is very natural. For us, it seems very far away and not really the first step. But for us, again, say Russia, the Baltic states are much closer. How do you see this kind of, diversity factor playing in, and what is the role of Europe between China and US. I think in the last scenario you had a really interesting idea of Europe in a way pushing China and US into kind of, if not a partnership, but at least cooperating on climate change, because I think that's something which is kind of looming for all of us, and we need solutions, and we need much better knowledge what's going on and what kind of solutions are needed. But how do you see Europe playing out in this technological competition between US and China?
Well, just as you say, I think there's a real positive contribution that Europe can make of trying to keep a lid, I would say, on the U.S.-China rivalry. There's some self-interest involved in this. I commented, Germany, Finland, other countries are very dependent on the trade and investment with China. So but I think so keeping the lid, trying to lower some of the tensions, trying to find a way that you can bring together, given the challenges like climate change, where we all have to be very invested in it, trying to bring the different partners together is one big area. I would say the other has been that Europe has been out front in thinking about, protection for consumers on data privacy, where U.S. has a harder time doing, regulation, simply because we have these philosophical arguments over what is the role of government with business. So that is an area, and Europe is taking a lead on thinking through AI as well. So there are areas, I think, where Europe has made a huge contribution. I think where we have to worry a little bit is where we get, and that's in one of the scenarios, too much of a regionalization, where Europe has its own standards and rules, which limit some of the cooperation even with the U.S., and China has its own rules, and U.S. has its own rules. So you begin to rebuild some of these walls that we thought, came down after the end of the Cold War, and we had globalization. But I think there is, on both sides, you have now a dialogue going on between U.S. and EU on technology and on economic issues. So in a sense, there's a big advantage that we would have, both of us, transatlantic, if we keep this much more cooperation. And that is good for both of our industry, for our consumers, and also for the broader geopolitical competition.
Just to add very briefly, because Fran Burwell is going to speak on the next panel, who is really at the heart of sort of those questions. I think one of the challenges for Europe, and that builds on what Matt has said, is obviously the internal compromise-seeking mechanism that always makes it difficult to really react in that sense. But also the challenge, I think, for the future in this fierce geopolitical contest is to really get out of the role of being always a passive actor. It always seems that if you do geopolitical risk analysis, Europe is reacting to something, whether it's coming from the United States or from China. And this push for strategic autonomy, or this push for a geopolitical commission, as Ursula von der Leyen recently labeled it, I think is an attempt to move out of this reactive role and move forward with privacy protection, standardization, using its market size to push through standards, but also don't not be pushed around by secondary sanctions, by the mechanics or the mechanics or the tools of the geopolitical contest. And I think that will be the challenge in the next couple of years, to really leverage those strengths and be an active player in and of itself, even without big tech companies. I think this is one of the challenges that Europe has, is that they don't have they don't have an Amazon, they don't have a Facebook in that sense. So the regulatory capacity is what matters and can be leveraged.
I think you are right on that. Europe being rather reactive, of course, then it's not a nation state. It's 27 sovereign states forming something which is more than an international organization, but not in a way a sovereign actor. On the other hand, a very successful project in Europe, which I think quite a lot of people outside, when they're looking for solutions, are envying that the Europeans have been able to create something which is rather unique, but of course still work in progress. In the second scenario, in a way, the good outcome very much depends on the goodwill of big corporations. And we know that both in the US and in China, the big corporations have been driving force of many of those technological solutions. What is there for the big companies? Because in a way, they fear now that the governments will force on them their ideas, how they should be acting. How can we get the big companies to play their role in a responsible way, and at the same time way that they are willing to invest in new technologies and in a way helping us all?
Well, yeah, when you think back, you just started with about steam engines.
Yeah.
I mean, and when you're thinking back in the history of the U.S., I mean, these are the railway barons, and you had Rockefeller, obviously, with Standard Oil, so a big monopoly. But companies transitioned. I mean, obviously, and it was unsustainable socially, to continue this huge, where these, some called them robber barons, too, amassed huge wealth. They were paying very little income tax at that point. They were running monopolies, and a lot of those were broken up. They became very successful companies after that, and you had more, you'd say a better, more social equilibrium, where that also with trade unions began to be a lot more important. So I see this kind of as we're at this point where the equilibrium that we had, I mean, where they're just starting off and they're offering all these opportunities for consumers. I mean, none of us could exist without the internet now. But at such a point, I mean, then there are certain problems that develop, and society has to figure out solutions. And I don't see them as going to be big losers. I think they're going to be always very important actors, but they have to begin to adapt to the changing circumstances. I think the one big question, and this is when you're looking at innovation, is the big companies tend to, and you hear this in Silicon Valley, are gobbling up a lot of the startups to put them out of business because they could pose as competition down the road. And there are, advocates, even right in, you could say, at the core of the technology revolution, Silicon Valley, that would believe that actually, for innovation's sake, a smaller Google may be a better Google. Now, I mean, there's Google will never, I think they feel the pressure, but that's something we also have to deal with, and that's obviously where the EU Commission is also believing that the big companies are actually preventing the development of European tech companies. So we have to, there has to be a lot of things that are rethought. I mean, there's, basically on competition theory and where the kind of balance should go between consumer rights and companies, and how do you, the big question for society, I think, is how do you keep the innovation going? Because, we're only at the very, very beginning of this technology revolution, and what we want to see, we can see a lot more progress, and we want to keep that going. And we want to really favor sometimes the small guy here so that they can offer some of these new ways of doing business and new opportunities for humanity.
I think the one thing that I would add to this is, ultimately, if we are operating in a market economy, it's in the interest of the company to make money, right? I'm a big fan of Luhmann's system theory, so the code of the economy is to generate profit. In and of itself, there's nothing wrong with that. So ultimately, there is a self-interest of preserving the system under which market mechanisms or profit generation is most likely, and that's in a lot of ways a liberal democracy. So one of the scenarios where companies at the end start seeing the benefits of re-educating people instead of just pushing through fierce automation is to exactly that, preserving liberal democracy. And I think in the past, Karl Polanyi wrote about this in 1944, great transformation. You always have a shift between market and disembedding in terms of how much embedment of the economy is there from a society perspective. And Matt has spoken about the monopolies in the past, and there was a movement away from that. There was social policies being put in place, unionization efforts that strengthened working rights. Now there's in the academia there's debate of whether robots should be able to unionize, or how sort of you think about something like this in the future. And I do believe that the pendulum swings one way or one way to the other, and the question is whether it needs a catastrophe or it needs an external event in that sense that leads to the change. We label this the million workers march to Washington. It would be nice if something like this doesn't have to happen before there's a policy change, but often those fierce events lead to change because they illustrate the dynamics to the extent.
Something which I found very interesting in this report is that when we think about the change of work, the new work, it requires quite a lot of retraining, lifelong learning, and it really emphasizes the role of education in our societies. And I think that's something which is discussed all too little. We are maybe talking about the education of elites, but we really need educate much broader groups of society so that everybody can benefit out of the modern technology and also participate in the modern technology and then be useful workers in a technology-driven economy. Your thoughts on that?
100% agree.
All I can say is I think Finland could be a model for the U.S. You have your educational system, actually provides, if you look at the test scores and so on, a much better preparation in terms of basic skills than ours in this country. And, there's a recent study that AEI did looking at retraining programs in the U.S., and those were instituted in the mid-1990s, and we spend very little money in this country on retraining. We're not very serious about it, even though we have, a huge issue, even with the, as Julian was talking about during with the transition to service economies where lots of workers were thrown out of business or out of jobs. So yeah, we got to get serious about it, and I think at some point that will happen, but we certainly have been dragging our feet.
One last thing. Concerning the kind of infrastructure, there was a sentence, I think, in this report that everybody has a smart device in his pocket or hand. Finland is the chair country of Freedom Online Coalition, and we had our ministerial meeting last week. And I remember in my speech, in that context, I said that there are 4 billion people who are not connected globally. And also in this country, this is a big question, that how can you kind of equalize the small cities, the countryside, with the big cities in order to create better opportunities when we are moving towards a more digitalized economy. Do you think there will be a consensus on something like that was done in 1930s with the rural electrification here, or how do you see it? Will this be a kind of factor which will level up things, or a kind of thing which will make the cleavages even larger?
Well, I think, with the infrastructure bill passing, and broadband was one of those issues where there was a concession on both sides, Republicans and Democrats, that should be considered critical infrastructure. I think where you're seeing that movement, and even before this, you had states very concerned about trying to provide broadband to rural areas. So I think that, just as you said, I like in the 1930s with rural electrification, I think that is coming to pass. I think the bigger issue will be in the developing world, where you've seen some progress, particularly mobile, like Kenya is way out front on mobile banking. But where you really, there's so many challenges to really providing connectivity to lots of the African states and also other parts of the world, that it will still be some time before you get there. But I think there are a lot of companies and entrepreneurs thinking about very inventive World Wide Web systems, satellite based. Where you could actually see, in the case of Africa, benefiting hugely because you wouldn't have to put in, the kind of infrastructure in very difficult circumstances to provide that service.
Yeah, the pandemic in a way has illustrated the benefits of working from home, but you can only do this if you have good internet connectivity. But I think events like this are opportunities to show what can change, what needs to change. And I would agree with Matt that heavy investment in infrastructure, critical infrastructure that includes broadband access, can to a great extent revive some of rural areas that have sort of been cut off from economic wealth generation. And then obviously if you talk about Africa, if you talk about sort of the provision of broadband access of 5G, multiple private companies are active in that. You're back in the geopolitical realm of banning Huawei or banning the sort of provision from Chinese companies in that sense. So that will be the chessboard of the future, if you think about that. But maybe contributions to a next report.
All right, thank you. I think we are more or less in time. So thank you for you, and thank you for listening.
Thank you.
Hello, My name is Cynthia Yu, and I am the president of the George Washington University Debate and Literary Society. It's an honor for us to be here today. Thank you to the Embassy of Finland for inviting us to today's event. For today's deliberation, Unpacking the Geopolitics of Technology, Perspectives from Generation Z, we have been asked to deliberate the topic statement, what is the greatest technological initiative for transatlantic cooperation? In response to this, 3 GW teams have created multimedia projects to answer the question in the videos you're about to see. We hope you enjoy our arguments and perspectives, and thank you again for inviting us to participate.
Generation Z was born into an era of digitalization and emerging global concerns. The technologies of tomorrow hold the promise of solving many of today's problems, but tomorrow's technologies will require a new generation of batteries. This is why we believe the greatest priority for transatlantic technology cooperation is improving the longevity and sustainability of lithium-ion batteries.
Lithium-ion batteries are, per the Clean Energy Institute, high-quality rechargeable batteries with the potential to make clean electric energy a reality. The European Parliament briefing on EU legislation in progress articulates the broad applications and importance of lithium-ion batteries as follows.
From transport, climate action, and energy to waste and resources, the development, production, and use of batteries impact EU sustainability goals, the rising digital economy, and an ever-growing number of portable electronics. LIBs have broad applications. We will focus on batteries as the key to net zero carbon emissions by means of electric cars. Batteries can transform the electric transportation industry.
Investment in LIBs have large payoffs and can produce rapid changes. Studies show research and development cause rapid cost declines for LIBs. This drop in cost demonstrates the power that investing in this technology can have.
High-powered lithium-ion batteries could make gas stations obsolete not only for personal and public transportation, but also for delivery of our goods and services in the logistical sector. Vulcan Energy Resources is making these investments to streamline their manufacturing processes using LIBs to achieve zero-emission electric car production in 2023. Not only will LIB technology achieve zero carbon, but this technology will actually produce excess clean energy that offsets fossil fuels. Thus, LIB research and development is essential to immediate actions toward addressing climate change.
And on top of that, LIBs are the most politically feasible method of transatlantic technology cooperation. Transatlantic cooperation is necessary within this space to produce the research and design necessary to bring LIBs to the next level on 2 fronts, increasing capacity and extending the battery's life. There are tangible market and technological benefits to broad-based investments in LIBs development.
The EU recognizes this. Their $3.2 billion investment in LIBs is targeted at net zero emissions by 2050. America ought to join this effort, and evidence demonstrates that they are doing just that through a partnership created by the US and Finland to produce transatlantic research on LIBs. Ongoing partnerships demonstrate that there is a demand and political feasibility for transatlantic partnership toward necessary research and development on LIBs.
Developing better lithium-ion batteries is the next step towards achieving a green economy. Transatlantic cooperation on this initiative is the singular most important measure of ensuring the developed world moves away from gas and towards renewable electric energy for all. Thank you.
Was it going to be three videos, right?
Hi, everybody. Sorry for the delay there. Thank you again to the students of GW for presenting us with these videos. We'll be putting on 2 more during today's event, kind of interspersed between the events as we do stage changes. And again, they are in the audience today, so thank you guys all again for contributing and for attending. I'd now like to pass it on to our next panel. I'm going to let Steve do the introductions for us, but we're really looking forward to this great event, and I hope you guys enjoy.
Thanks so much. Thanks so much. Thanks for having us today. This is really a privilege to moderate this panel. I'm a big admirer of Matt Burrows and Julian for their report. I'm a senior fellow on Matt's team. Just to set up what we're going to discuss right now, which is the race, the technological race, it's instructive to pay attention to one part of the technological contest, and that is it pivots right off of this video, and it's batteries and electric vehicles. So the United States is at the forefront of electric cars. We're hearing month by month announcements of new gigafactories, gigantic battery factories being planned. What we haven't seen is any announcements, even a single announcement of who's going to supply the material that goes into those batteries. And that whole supply chain is dominated by China. What that means is that for this entire decade, our car companies, GM, Ford, and Tesla too, are going to rely on the United States' greatest technological rival to supply the materials to compete with it. And so the question, arises in your mind is did anyone ask China if it's willing to reliably and without interruption do that? Just to point out why that's a very important question. Remember how the Asian part of World War II began. The United States cut off oil to Japan, and then Japan bombed Pearl Harbor. And so with that very nice thought, I'm going to start out, and we're going to start out with just a couple of minutes of just remarks from each panelist, and then we'll get into a conversation, and then we'll open it up for some questions from the audience. Fran, if we can begin with you, the question arose. Europe has really taken a leadership position on so many parts of the biggest technological questions, and that's put it in the driver's seat of these geopolitical the geopolitical race. Can you just unpack that in a brief thing, and then we'll get into it more later.
Sure. I think that to say that Europe is in the driver's seat is perhaps an overestimation, but that's certainly where they want to be. And I think that they have come to the conclusion, at least at the EU level, that when you're talking about the geopolitics of technology, they don't have some of the resources that we have brought. For example, they have not proven able to scale up to big companies as we have. When you think about geopolitics, traditionally we think about military, we think about the economics, we think even about population. And yet when we talk about the geopolitics of technology, we really end up talking about companies. And they are the ones who have the intellectual property, that have the revenues, that are able to, as the previous panel discussed, move through people, help people move in certain directions. The US is the champion of innovation, and we're the champion of scaling up companies. I don't think there's any doubt about that. Europe has not been doing that. And I think that they have come to conclusions faster than we have in the United States, that what you really need, if you don't always have the resources to play in the geopolitical arena, you need a strategy. And here I would say that China has a strategy, a very state-centric strategy. It's about increasing the power of the state. The United States does not really have a strategy. It's early days yet for the Biden administration, but I'm looking forward to hearing from Peter today. But Europe has a very comprehensive approach, and it's kind of two-pronged. One is the issue that was brought up earlier about democratization and extremism, this tension in terms of the content that is delivered by the internet. And here we see a great deal of work on content moderation. what's allowable, how quickly it needs to be taken down if it's not allowable, what are the penalties. It's onerous for the companies, but probably pretty doable. Then we have a whole set of rules that is about the role of companies, the role of technology. And this is the Digital Markets Act, the Digital Services Act, which also addresses content moderation and the responsibilities of providers of content. We have the Data Governance Act that has come out. This is about creating pools of data, including publicly available data, as a resource for others in Europe and elsewhere who may want to use it. We have the AI Act that has also come out. And we have more on the way. We have a cloud strategy. We have a battery strategy. And I think that the video that we just saw was right on the mark. The question is this for Europe. A lot of people would argue that regulation and innovation are on this scale, and the more regulation you have, the less innovation you're going to have. I think Europe has made the decision, rightly or wrongly, that if you have regulation, you will get innovation. Innovation that responds to your regulation for example, trustworthy AI. It's almost like a brand, if you will. And Europe has taken the perspective, the EU has taken the perspective that they were very successful with their privacy legislation, the General Data Protection Regulation, or GDPR. And this was something that has become largely a global standard. Many, many non-European companies are GDPR compliant and use it in their global operations. It's just easier for the companies to do that. And Europe has not been shy about saying that that's what they want to do on AI. That's what they want to do on a lot of content moderation and other things. That these rules that they're putting out, they want them to be global standards. So the question when you come back to geopolitics is the ability to regulate, does it create more barriers so that you don't have enough innovation and strength? Or does it give you a platform to create global standards and play a big role in the geopolitics of technology?
Very, very good. We will unpack that further in this. Mike Horowitz, I forgot to say that Fran is a distinguished fellow at the European Center at the Atlantic Council. I'm going to introduce Mike. You're next up. Director of the Perry World House at UPenn. Mike, we were exchanging emails before this, and you pointed out how AI is having such a profound impact on geopolitics, on society. Can you unpack that a little bit for us? Yeah.
Absolutely, and thanks for having me today. I think it's really interesting, and this builds on Fran's remarks in some ways, that we're having this conversation in the midst of course, the Big Democracy Summit. And the reason is that I think that there's growing research that suggests that technology leadership in the 21st century is going to depend on cooperation between countries and between like-minded countries and probably between more democratic or more free societies. You know, think about, and I'll turn to AI in a second, but think about semiconductors and the sort of most advanced semiconductor plants in the world, you know, which currently are in Taiwan, and where their key components come from. They come from the Netherlands, they come from Japan, they come from the United States, they come from a lot of different countries and places that together make these, you know, the incredible TSMC plants work. And that, I think, is what is going to be necessary for a lot of technology leadership in this era of strategic competition. Cooperation between like-minded countries. And I think AI is certainly an example of that as well. You know, I think, you know, if we imagine artificial intelligence as machines doing things that we used to think required human intelligence, you know, this is something in one way or another has been around for decades, but has accelerated recently in the last decade or so due to advances in machine learning. And there are lots of questions out there about what AI will mean for the world. But what it's important to understand in this context, and this is in contrast to something like semiconductors, is that AI is a general purpose technology, like the combustion engine, like electricity, things before it. It's not a widget that or magic pixie dust that's just going to be sort of plugged into things. And applications of AI are going to differ across societal usages. I mean, anybody with a smartphone right now, there's AI built in there that we use every day and don't even think about as AI, because once we figure out how to program something, we tend to call it programming instead of calling it AI. So the goalposts are always shifting. But the general purpose technologies are extremely disruptive. They cause the rise and decline of companies. They drive the rise and decline of countries. And that's why when we talk about competition in the context of AI, if you think about the report from the US National Security Commission on Artificial Intelligence, that there's been concern about China's investments in these areas, about the data that China holds. If we think about concern with apps like TikTok, and this is where free societies will need to work together to ensure leadership. And it's not just a societal question or an economic question, but I think a military question as well. Just as the Democracy Summit is happening, they're out in Geneva. We're out in Geneva having conversations about lethal autonomous weapon systems. And my point here is not to get into those specifically. That is a rabbit hole we don't want to discuss. But these conversations are happening essentially simultaneously across all of these different areas. And this competition is happening across all of these different areas at once, which means that free societies will need a multifaceted response, and one that based fundamentally in the way, say from an American perspective, the intersection of free markets, the engine of innovation, and governments. The best way to do it won't necessarily be the way that China does it. It'll be the best way for the United States and its allies and partners to do it.
Great, thanks, Mike. Now we're gonna turn to Peter Harrell, Senior Director for International Economics and Competitiveness at the NSC. So for several years, there's been discussion in foreign policy circles, security circles, about the rebordering of China and the United States, and the regionalization of these two great powers, big powers. Can you? So we don't need the concept, but because everyone knows that. Where are we now? We seem to have gone very, very far down that road. Where are we now with that, with regionalization?
So that's a great question, and I appreciate being on this panel along with a couple of distinguished colleagues. It's a real pleasure and opportunity for me to be able to be here. Look, I think it's clear that we are in an era of strategic competition with China, right? And that means competition in the economic domain, that means competition in the diplomatic domain, and it certainly means competition in the technological domain. Because we see China as a competitive rival, and it is, of course, using its access to technology to strengthen its position in that competition, to develop new high-end weapons systems, right, to help show its diplomatic and economic leadership globally. And so, we have to recognize we are competing in the technological domain. That doesn't mean sort of hostility, but it does mean competition. And I think, you, Fran, said, kind of raised the point about what's the strategy, right? And I think that as we, as an administration, think about our strategy for technological competition with China, it really does start with the set of domestic investments we're trying to make. And I know that sort of often gets viewed as like a throwaway line that I have to say as an administration official, but I mean it. And, I come to these events and I always get introduced as a senior director in the National Security Council, and that's true, but I am also co-equally dual-hatted to the National Economic Council, and I spend every bit as much time with Brian Deese the director of the National Economic Council as I do with Jake Sullivan, which I think reflects kind of the fact for the president, he really does believe investments begin at home because, fundamentally, we can impose all the export controls we want, on things like semiconductors and AI and, these other critical technologies. And we can either, cajole or coerce our allies into coming along with us on that. But if we're not remaining the innovative leader here, because China is, it's a real economy with talented people and good universities, right? It is an innovative economy in itself. And so you can't win the competition just by protecting what we have. We actually have to stay ahead and out-innovate them, right? And that's why we have been so committed as an administration pushing Congress, and I do think they'll get it across the finish line next year to pass the USICA Act, which will include, often think about the semiconductor money, but there's also a ton of money for the NSF there. Why, if you look at our budgets that we've been proposing, both in the infrastructure bill, but also in the reconciliation bill, as well as annual budgets that we'll hopefully get through Congress next year, we're looking at really substantial boosts in domestic R&D and in innovation. And so, we really see that as absolutely core and the first element of our strategy. Sorry, because we were talking about EV electric vehicles, that's another area. I think EV is actually an era where, you kindly suggested, Steve, that this was an era where maybe we were ahead. I'd actually posit it's an area where we are behind today, right? I mean, if you look at the global EV market, China is has about 12% of Chinese cars, China being the largest car market in the world, about 12% are EVs, right? We're at about 3%. Europe's at about 8%, right? This is actually not a contest that if you were looking at objectively, you'd say we're in a position, although we have the most innovative company, particularly Tesla, and we have other companies coming online. If you look at where the market is, it's not one where we're particularly leading. And so there too, like you see us focusing so much on EVs, yes, first and foremost because of our climate goals, but also because this is going to be the transportation technology of the future. And if we don't have a dominant market, at the end of the day, the innovation is going to move overseas, right, to serve where the market is. So we're very focused on that from a sort of technological competitiveness, making sure we remain leaders in innovation in vehicles, the way we were, when the combustion engine and the car were invented here. So we start really with domestic investments at home. Also with our allies and partners. We welcome work that the European Union is doing to strengthen semiconductor supply chains, to strengthen EVs there. I mean, we think there is tremendous work with our allies and partners, and share very much Mike's point that we have to work with our allies and partners in order to stay ahead as kind of like-minded democracies. And then, of course, there is the protect part. I mean, the protect part is also important. We're innovating here. We need to be innovating here. We do need to protect our competitive edge. And that's why I think you've seen us maintain a number of the important export control restrictions that were imposed by the prior administration on companies like Huawei, on companies like Fujian Jinhua Semiconductor, which stole American technology, to make sure that where there is an illicit transfer of technology from the US to a rival, that we are able to impose some costs and make sure that that doesn't happen in the first place.
Okay, great. Let me dig in a little bit with you here, Peter. Geopolitical strength comes from home, right? And you dug in a little bit on the EV front, and that's good. So we have Tesla, right? Yes, China sells more EVs, and so does Europe, but who sells, of all those cars, who sells the most cars, and who brought on the EV race? Who invented every lithium-ion technology that's out there? Americans did, and then they were applied and commercialized elsewhere. When I look at those two industries, I look at that, the invention happened here. The leader of the industries is here, yet the outcome that you described happens. And I wonder on those whether I see how slow everyone else is moving. Europe is putting down stakes all across the battery chain, the EV chain. U.S. is not, and I want, apart from Elon Musk, do we have vision? Does American industry have the guts to win this? I'm asking you.
Me?
Yeah.
I think absolutely. Look, I think it's something we have to do in partnership between the government and American industry. But I think we absolutely do, and I think you are seeing that. You're seeing our companies and our allied, companies from our allied countries that build cars here, moving out very robustly on that. Right? We have seen Ford announce plans. I was meeting with them yesterday. Announce plans to transition a majority of their production to EVs over the next decade or so. GM making similar commitment. So I think we are, and we're seeing like Volkswagen, right? Volkswagen is building EVs for the American market in Tennessee and has plans to scale that up. So again, something we're doing very much with our allies and partners. I think that as the industry beyond Tesla sees that we as a country are committed to transitioning to EVs, right? They understand the policy framework is going to be, we are moving to EVs for climate reasons, for national security reasons. They are realizing they need to transition themselves as well. So I think having that kind of clear policy vision is giving the market the incentive the market needs in order to go out and innovate and figure out how to get there. And it's a really important, I think EVs are a great example, right? Because if you look at the American car companies that are leading in EVs, whether it's Tesla or GM or Ford or the ones that are coming in, they are all truly global with key partners and allies. Who makes Tesla's batteries? It's Panasonic. Panasonic, a Japanese firm, is Tesla's battery partner. SK, a South Korean firm, is Ford's battery partner. Samsung, another South Korean firm, just announced it will be Chrysler. Chrysler is now called Stellantis. It will be Chrysler's battery partner. Right? So this is a clear example of where we have to work and are working with allies and partners to make sure this industry, we maintain a leadership position in this industry. So I think it's a real perfect example of how government can set kind of a policy framework and the vision, and we're now seeing American companies, allied and partnered companies come together to get there. Now it's going to take continued work over the next couple of years, 10 years to actually get there. We have to build out charging stations and the rest, but I think we'll get there. Now the one point I do want to make, we talk about batteries, and I think you're going to see a lot of final assembly battery here. SK, for example, has a plant in Georgia that's supplying VW in Tennessee. The minerals part of this is an interesting part of the geopolitics, right? Because you might be assembling the batteries here. The inputs are coming from somewhere. And while some of that product can come from the United States, lithium, for example, the primary ingredient, is something that actually there are fairly substantial reserves of in the U.S. A number of those minerals aren't here in large quantities, right? Cobalt, for example, 70% is concentrated in Democratic Republic of Congo, key ingredient in batteries. And so I do think there's like an emerging geopolitics around the sourcing of minerals that is going to play an increasingly important part of sort of American and allied foreign policy over the next couple of years.
Right, great. Fran, so I wanted to turn back to Europe, and if we can do it in the context, we've gotten a very good overview of where the U.S. is. You said something very, very interesting. Europe has taken the position that if you have regulation, you'll get innovation, and in a number of areas we've seen that. So Europe has been aggressive with big tech. Mm-hmm. It has been aggressive on the EV front, on the battery front. Why doesn't the United States follow Europe?
Well, I think we have two different cultures when it comes to regulatory policy. And here, we tend to not regulate until we see harm. In Europe, it's much more based on what they would call the precautionary principle, which has raised its head in many a trade dispute between the United States and the EU in the past, which is basically that if it's new and it might cause harm, we need to restrain it in some way or make sure that that harm is minimized in some way before it gets to the market or before it becomes too powerful in the market. So with AI, for example, I see not very much of an interest here in regulating AI as it hits consumers. But in Europe, you do see that. And you see, for example, a distinction that they're making now in the AI Act between high risk and minimal risk. There is also, though, the idea that some AI, and here they really look at facial recognition technology and surveillance, not so much like you can do it, but not have it live stream, if you will, but maybe use it for, because they do have a significant terrorism problem as well. And so trying to balance those competing ideas, but with AI itself looking at if it is just your normal, like you were saying on the phone, you know, AI is everywhere in a lot of products nowadays. And most of them are not consequential, right? But if you have clothing that has AI in it to monitor your medical condition, that can be consequential. So that would be high risk. So I think that they are also looking at Europe is also looking at the issues that technology has caused in society and trying to figure out how to moderate those, while also ensuring that they have the same rules across the EU. So one reason the EU itself does so much regulation is because the 27 member states regulate a lot. And rather than having 27 different markets, they want to have one market, because one market is bigger, it's more commercially viable, et cetera. And so I think that setting a framework that can apply across all of these countries is one of the reasons they regulate so much. But I think they also see a purpose in it, and not just in the regulation, but in state action, if I can put it that way. And I think when it comes to EVs, for example, right now in the EU, countries are having approved plans. They've been given a certain pot of money by the EU to recover from the pandemic. And they have been given, they've been asked to present plans, and these are now, I think most of them are now approved. They had to provide 20% of that plan had to be dedicated towards digital. They also have a Fit for 55, this is the climate action plan. And this, when all the legislation has passed, not all of it has passed yet, but when it has, it will require EV charging stations every, I think it's 150 meters, 150 kilometers, sorry, so that there will be a regular network of EV charging stations. This is a plug for your infrastructure bill. But you know, it takes a certain amount of state action to make transformations like that. And Europe has looked at the EU has looked at the environment and tried to figure out where it can strategically add value to what is happening. That's the reason that they have a battery alliance. That's the reason that they're looking at cloud. You may not always agree with what they're doing. There are some very problematic aspects to the amount and the qualities of different EU regulations that are coming down the pike. But it is an attempt to respond to the new environment in a way that would protect Europeans, sometimes maybe too much, we might think, from an American perspective, but that's the political decision that they've made.
Right. Where is I'm sensing where is where are the areas of EU regulation, rather than starting with that Europe is over-regulated? How about where are the regulations in tech where Europe has gone ahead, and look at them here? What are there any of those?
So I think that there's some very interesting things in content moderation, particularly, and their attempts to tone down what you see on social media. But there are problems with that in terms of transferring it simply over here. Europe has a concept called illegal hate speech, and we don't really have the same thing. It is illegal to incite racial or ethnic hatred or hatred of similar types online. And if Facebook, for example, is notified that so-and-so has posted X, then they have a certain amount of time in which to review that and take it down. It's not dependent upon the company's own rules and regulations like it is here. So many Europeans were very puzzled as to why it was that Facebook and Twitter ended up taking President Trump off their networks rather than the US government acting, if you understand that. But we have the First Amendment, and that makes it a different environment. But I do think there are some techniques there that we could learn from. So there are some places. And yesterday, for example, was the first meeting of the US-EU technology competition technology dialogue. And I think that some comparisons there about what works and what doesn't work in alleviating some of the network effects of the big tech companies. There'll probably be some more discussions there. And we have something that Peter has been key in, which is the Transatlantic Trade and Technology Council. And although it is not a rule-making body, decision-making body, it's a great forum, a great platform for the US and Europe to talk about these different issues and to figure out what lessons we can learn from each other that can apply in our systems, which are different.
Yeah. Great, thanks. Mike, I wanted to turn to the US-China relationship. Are we in a Cold War?
I think it's a great question. I think the term Cold War has become politically loaded, in a way, and with my academic hat on, of course, one can point out a number of differences between the U.S.-China relationship and the U.S.-Soviet relationship, such as the much greater degree of economic interdependence between the U.S. and China compared to the U.S. and the Soviet Union. But to me, it's less important whether we call it a Cold War, and more important that we acknowledge that it's competition. In that my sense is that when several years ago, when the United States, from a government perspective, became comfortable using the word competition to directly talk about what was happening with China, the Chinese response was, "Yeah, we're definitely competing with you. That's what we're trying to do," and that recognition in the United States is, I think, then been important for galvanizing, some of the administration initiatives that Peter's been talking about and that the Biden administration is doing, and for focusing on the challenge that China presents to American leadership in a number of areas. There are the broader economic areas that we've talked about. There are specific technology verticals where we worry about Chinese leadership, such as artificial intelligence. There's military competition questions, especially in the Indo-Pacific, but elsewhere as well. And one of the things that I think has been really interesting in the transition from the Trump administration to the Biden administration is that while a lot of things have changed, like a lot of things have changed, broadly the notion of understanding China as a competitor in one way or another is something that is consistent. the Biden approach, of course, to to China, helmed by Kirk Campbell and others, certainly has differences from what the Trump administration did. But the notion of this as a competition remains. And so whether we call it a Cold War or not is, I think, less important than acknowledging that reality. And I think that reality is important because it gets to things like the importance of things like intellectual property and other sorts of issues. I mean, one gets the sense sometimes that the United States was perhaps very willing to accept, say, unequal terms of trade from China. If you think about China's accession to the WTO and the sort of regulations surrounding that, because the United States was so far ahead that the benefits of free trade that you can that are clear from economic theory seemed to mean that this would inevitably benefit the United States, and it did. But then it also enabled China to catch up, and perhaps to catch up faster than some people had anticipated, leading to this situation right now. Whereas I think, as you pointed out at the beginning of this panel, where simultaneously the United States seeks technology leadership in areas where it wants to source some of the materials from the country it's competing with. Like, that's kind of awkward and a little bit different, certainly, than it was during the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union. And I think that's the multifaceted nature of that competition with China that's then critical. It's not just a military competition. It's not just a military competition in the Indo-Pacific. It's very much an economic competition, and especially one focused on technological leadership, insofar as we believe that this will be that innovation in these emerging technology areas, whether we think about EVs, whether we think about quantum, cyber, AI, et cetera, that'll be critical for jobs and for societal growth moving forward.
Okay, let me ask this. This is for Mike and Peter, and it's again on China and its resources. So again, China controls 70 to 80% of the battery metals supply chain, the processing of these metals. We will rely on China for this whole decade for these resources. Rare earth metals, across the board, the technologies that deal with climate change. And so the question, are we marching into a decade and longer in which resources are a flashpoint, like the South China Sea, like Taiwan, are now between the U.S. and China?
So I'll give an answer, then he can give the right answer. I think resources have always been a flashpoint. If you look historically, resource competition, resource conflict has always been a thing. I think the United States seems to be moving with, I would say, different levels of speed in different industry areas toward trying to alleviate those issues. I mean, that's where the notion of I think technology cooperation between free societies comes in and becomes important. Think about some of the take semiconductors. I mentioned at the beginning Taiwan produces the world's leading semiconductors right now, sourcing components from a lot of democratic states. There are lots of efforts to diversify supply. TSMC is looking at production and building plants in the United States. There are efforts to work with Samsung in South Korea and elsewhere to create new fabrication plants. A lot of the elite design work for semiconductors is done in the United States, and working on then sourcing those materials and the materials you need to basic components from places other than China, and that may mean that there's something of a transition period, and it may generate challenges. But to the extent that this is increasingly a national security issue, it makes finding those alternative sources a priority, It means diversifying supply becomes a priority. And that is just simply different than I think say just to pick on Peter, than the world that Peter and I sort of grew up in, where that was less of a concern because we could just trust, you trust that globalization in the market would allow for the rapid lowest cost distribution of even the most critical raw supplies. I mean, maybe that's not the world we're going to be living in anymore, and the United States seems to be adapting to that challenge. Peter?
I think I generally agree with Mike, both on the point that, there's always been competition for resources, right? You think about the sort of pipeline politics and, all that. There's always been competition for resources. It is, I think, the sort of specific resources about which we're competing may be evolving, but I don't think this is a new phenomenon. It's certainly something, as we think about sort of the metals and minerals, an issue we as an administration are increasingly focused on, prodding, for example, our U.S. Development Finance Corporation to look for kind of global opportunities to invest in mining and mineral processing. You're correct, actually, the vulnerability is often more on the processing than on kind of where the ore itself comes from. So sort of looking at it that way, working with other like-minded democracies that have a lot of minerals like Australia and Canada on how can we develop some collective approaches to this. Also on building kind of key components, it's not just the minerals. So give an example of something. The U.S. is heavily dependent right now on Chinese companies for solar panels, right? China technology invented here. China managed to capture a lot of the global market. We're now trying to recapture it. Just yesterday, or maybe it was 2 days ago, the U.S. Development Finance Corporation announced a $500 million deal with a U.S. solar company to build production facilities in India, right? An allied country really trying to put together capital, private sector expertise, an ally on how do we diversify our supply chain. So yeah, I think the resources are changing, and I think we are, working to adapt to the new reality. I do want to make a moment, though, come back to a point Fran has been touching on sort of digital technology issues, something that, as you can imagine, occupies quite a bit of our time, and particularly the issues we are having with Europe right now. And the first thing is, I would say, I think there's actually been some heartening signs over the last couple of years, and you were talking about some of this, Fran, of the way Europe is actually trying to create a more innovative economy in the technology space. And I think they understood that they were actually at kind of serious risk. I mean, I was talking earlier this year to a German industrialist, and he was pointing out to me, look, you think about cars, right? Core German technology. For a century, Germans developed expertise in, tubes and, spark plugs and things like that. But now cars are about software, right? I mean, they're about batteries and they're about software. And that's like a totally new expertise that, a manufacturing economy needs to develop. They historically haven't had a lot. And so, I think it's been heartening that you've seen Europe actually try to invest in, innovation and software and design, building on strengths in semiconductors and elsewhere that they've long had. And I think we're seeing some positive results there. I mean, I saw in the FT just this week, I think last year, for the first time since the FT had been recording this data, there were more unicorns in Europe than in China, right? I mean, that's a huge billion-dollar startups in Europe. That's a huge sign of progress coming together. On the regulatory front, because this is also an issue we, as you imagine, spend a lot of time with. I think you're seeing I think Lena is speaking here later this afternoon. And I think, one of the things you'll probably hear from Lena Khan at the FTC is that we as an administration do see kind of tough and smart regulation of the tech sector as important to ensuring we remain innovative here at home. I think that sort of when you see large tech platforms engaging in, buy and kill type transactions where they're buying a startup to kill it so it doesn't compete, that's not healthy to maintaining our competitive edge. Sometimes I think you see in the press this idea the US will win technology competition with China by having kind of our big national champions go mano a mano against the big Chinese national champions. That's not, for us as an administration, how we think we're going to win. We're going to win by being innovative, having a competitive economy and a competitive marketplace is absolutely key to that. And so smart competition policy, I think, is important to maintaining our edge and winning the competition. Now, you know, Europe is doing a lot of technology regulation. I think you hit it right, Fran. I think there are things that, you know, they have sort of, in many ways, good goals, but we do have concerns about some of the ways in which they're going about it that are going to have, we worry, you know, very serious unintended and adverse consequences to our collective ability to stay ahead. And so while we kind of welcome some of the goals of the regulation, we worry a lot about overreach in ways that will actually undermine our sort of long-term shared competitive advantage.
Thank you. Thanks. So I want to open up to questions. Anyone in the audience, put up your hand. We have mics somewhere, I was told. Do we still have them? Do we have someone? I don't see anyone does, but I still want to take. Here they're coming. Just if you don't mind identifying yourself. And then to whom, yes, this gentleman here is good to start with.
Hello, okay. Hi, my name is Patrick Lozada. I'm with the Telecommunications Industry Association. Thank you all for coming here today to speak on this important topic. Peter, you mentioned that one of the focuses of the Biden administration is focusing on investing here at home. And I'm wondering, this question for the whole panel, is there a tension, you think, between investing at home and working with our partners and allies around the world? For example, looking at things like Buy American provisions or the infrastructure bill's requirement to have 55% domestic content in ICT products and other products. How does this all shake out with respect to competition at the same time investing at home? Thank you.
You all would know better than me on this one.
All right. I actually think that you've put your finger on one of the problematic issues in the transatlantic space because it has been very difficult, and not just in the tech sector. We can look at the defense sector. During the early stage of the pandemic, we had some issues with vaccine components being held back from delivery. So I think that the question, particularly as we all think about not reshoring necessarily, but constraining what we used to do under a system of open and free trading, which I agree with you, Mike, that's what used to be, and that's not where we are right now. As we think about those constraints, how do we do that without being protectionist? And how do we do it particularly with our friends and partners? And I think that what Peter pointed out of this investment in India, I would say even more so, the United States and Europe need to get together and figure out how do we address these problems together so that we end up in the same side at the WTO rather than on opposite sides of a particular issue. It's not going to be easy, and it may be that there's actually political determination rather than letting the market figure this out. So that's where I'd come down on that. It is an issue, very real.
Let's so we can get as many questions as possible. Who's next? Do we have someone here? Great.
Thank you. I'm Ken Propp. I'm a fellow at the Atlantic Council, colleague of Fran's. My question comes from a similar direction. Peter has properly stressed the cooperative aspects of the technological efforts with Europe, but there is ultimately a self-interest dimension here that involves keeping resources at home, getting resources to the United States, localization, in a word. And this is a phenomenon that has played out in many different areas, not just physical, but also metaphysical areas like data. And Europe has moved very strongly in the area of data localization. Now, there's an obvious tension here with trade law principles, which are built on openness, non-discrimination. As the US moves in the same direction as Europe with strategic autonomy. And incidentally, you can see this tension within the European Union. The EU's trade officials refer to their strategy as open strategic autonomy, whatever that means.
Question.
The question is this. The question is there a reconciliation with trade principles that is possible here? Or are we going to see a step back from the open trading regime?
Who is this aimed at?
Peter, but whoever wants to take it.
Ken, it's good to see you. And you always ask the easy questions. And Patrick, you as well. Look, I'll offer some candid views on the trade law issue, and then talk a little bit about how we think about this practically with the Europeans. Look, I think I think if you look at sort of the development of the WTO, right, it is coming out of a world where, as Friedman said, the world is flat, right? And that's not the world we live in now. And I think you are seeing, like-minded democracies, including the US and Europe and Japan and South Korea and other places, take steps that I think back in the 90s we didn't think were sort of economically sensible, but today we do, with more investments in technology leadership and competitiveness. And I think there is going to be this kind of long-term process we're going to have to engage in about thinking through what is sort of the future of global trade law in a world where our domestic economic vision, not just here in the US, but in Europe and in Tokyo, has moved from when those rules were written, right? That's just a tension. Our domestic economic vision is not what it was when those rules were written. And I think that's something we're going to have to work through. Now, modernizing WTO, trade law was a very long-term process. So I don't think that but I think I think it's a good project for think tanks, because I think it's actually a really important set of issues for think tanks to begin to do some thought leadership on. What we are thinking about is sort of practically, how do we deal with these issues in, like, for example, the US-EU relationship? And, on the one hand, we can have this, like, punch list of things they do that we don't like, and things we do that they don't like, right? And the Europeans are sending in letters complaining about our EV tax credits. I'm like, well, how about your DMA that, only covers 5 American companies, right? I mean, we can sort of go through our punch list of objections to each other. And I think it is important that we get through the punch list and sort of figure out, ways to work. But I actually think the fact we are at kind of some inflection points in the way we approach things domestically does also give us very real ways to think kind of in smaller groups about what kind of new rules and new practices should look like, right? I think about this as semiconductors, right? We're hopefully, and I fully expect that come the end of January, we're going to have $52 billion to invest in semiconductors here in the US. European Union has announced plans to do $20 billion of semiconductors in Europe. Now, there are a lot of semiconductor CEOs who see this as and we love our semiconductor CEOs. I've spent a lot of time with semiconductor CEOs, great guys. They very understandably want to play us off against Europe, right? They want to, how much am I willing to pay them to build here? How much is Europe willing to pay them to build there? Very much the way our states kind of play off against each other for domestic incentives. We have to get out of that box with Europe, right? We need to come up with some sort of guidelines. We begin to talk through with the Commission, with member states about, here's what we think is kind of necessary levels of investment so that we can diversify a supply chain away from China and a few choke points in Asia, but where we're not simply in a bidding war with each other over this, right? So I actually think there's some areas in a very tangible way to think through cooperation as we both kind of move domestically in our economic policies from where we were 25 years ago.
Okay, I can't really see the clock. Can anyone see that?
2:26.
Okay, we can take one brief question. Okay.
Hi, so I'm Yishan Shu from the American Institute for Contemporary German Studies. I want to sort of, turn a question into sort of broader dimension. So up to now, we talk a lot about Europe and the United States, but the global technology adoption is way beyond that. So how about, the digital swing states? How about developing countries that are trying to catch up, hungry for new technologies? what is the playbook there? You know, the Chinese are spending a lot of money on in Africa and Southeast Asia. Their technologies are often a lot cheaper. They have a lot of conditions. For instance, some smartphones now being shipped in Africa come automatically with digital yuan wallet.
Question.
Right. So what is the playbook at the beginning? You know, do we actually have some viable strategies to compete in that space?
Who's that aimed at?
I think all the speakers who want to answer.
Okay.
Which one?
We have time for one person to represent everyone. Yeah.
So I would just say I think Peter should talk about the U.S. playbook. I would say that Europe has now put forward a new project ambitions. It's mostly reprogrammed money as opposed to new money. Let's be clear about that. To look at the Chinese Belt and Road, but it's mostly infrastructure. And I think Europe's tool of choice would be regulatory policy, and it will affect, and we do see their regulations being adopted in countries that don't necessarily have the capacity to adequately enforce them. I mean, I think this is a whole other issue we could talk about, but I think we should have Peter on.
I'd actually rather hear from you guys on what we should do here, I mean, being candid.
I mean, I would just add, I think that it's so clearly a play for data and for leadership by China. There's a government benefit essentially to exporting some digital tools of control. There's the way that China can then scrape data from all of these places if they're controlling some of their digital markets, and then use that for algorithm development back home. I think the challenge is that the playbook has to be twofold. I think that the first part of that, there's a part of that that's about governance. That's more about how the U.S. works with countries looking at adopting Chinese technology for governance purposes, and maybe tries to point out some of the challenges, especially given the conditions contained in lots of Belt and Road kinds of investments. I think the second part is there's a marketplace question. And this is where I think that there is potentially some tension with the desire for control over some products in the United States, and the need to compete potentially with Chinese products from an export market perspective. And that's a cost-benefit question that hopefully Peter and his colleagues are figuring out. Because on the one hand, we can compete with China to maybe take back some of that market share, since there's no doubt that I think there's a halo associated with some American company products in the digital space. But if those products aren't available at the right price points, not for corporate reasons, but for trade or financial reasons, then that creates obstacles.
We have to end it right there, unfortunately. Thank you very much. Thanks to the panel. This is a really terrific conversation today.
Thank you.
In summer 2021, cybercriminals breached Colonial Pipeline's cyber defenses, disrupting an entire U.S. energy market. Across the nation, prices shot up, disrupting sectors across the globe. This is just one example of a rapidly emerging threat to international security.
We believe that cybersecurity should be the greatest priority for transatlantic cooperation for two key reasons.
First, economic security. McAfee estimates that cybercrime costs the world $1 trillion annually, and that's only projected to rise. A recent study from Cybercrime magazine estimates that this number is projected to reach $6 trillion annually by 2021.
To put that into perspective, $6 trillion is nearly half of the entire European Union's GDP. If cyber attacks aren't properly addressed, trillions will leave taxpayers' wallets and enter the hands of criminals.
The second reason we ought to make cybersecurity the key transatlantic priority is the escalating threat to democracy. In recent years, we've seen hacking attacks against democratic elections and individual candidates because the tools of democracy and debate are increasingly digital. For example, 99% of the US's elections now take place through a computer or machine, and the rest of our world's nations are following suit.
Hackers from countries such as Russia, Iran, and Israel are actively seeking to interfere in elections across the globe. In Gambia, Kenya, In Ghana's most recent presidential elections, political tampering was discovered.
This isn't just a concern for developing nations. Germany is currently investigating Russia's repeated attempts to steal politicians' private information ahead of the 2021 German federal elections. As voting structures become increasingly digital, democracy will continue to be attacked.
We believe there are two transatlantic solutions. The first is the creation of a transatlantic cybersecurity council, which establishes a forum for threat collection.
In the status quo, the US and EU differ structurally in cybersecurity interventions and cybersecurity frameworks. We believe that the harmonization of best practices will close much of the gap in cybersecurity measures and bolster future innovation in the field.
A second transatlantic solution is expanding 5G projects. Earlier this year, Nokia was selected as a collaborator by the National Cybersecurity Center of Excellence for the US federal 5G cybersecurity project. We believe that cooperating with US and EU tech firms on 5G solutions can protect vulnerabilities and tighten digital security across the globe.
Cybersecurity is a threat to both global democracy and the global economy, two cornerstones of human progress. However, it's a threat that transatlantic cooperation can manage. Marching forward with the plan to protect our economic and democratic structures is the only way to provide a secure future for all.
All right, thank you again to GW. I'm going to request that everybody returns to their seats. We're about to commence with the keynote. I'll just give people a moment. And I'll just go ahead and do a quick intro. So we are thrilled today to have as our keynote Anne Neuberger, Deputy National Security Advisor for Cyber and Emerging Tech. She'll be joined in conversation by Stephanie Wander, who is Acting Director of the Atlantic Council's GeoTech Center. They'll be having a 30-minute fireside chat as today's keynote, and I think it's going to be a great conversation. We're really looking forward to it. So if everybody would just take their seats, we can go ahead and get started. Thank you.
And welcome, and thank you so much for keynoting this conference today. It's a joint collaboration between the Finnish Embassy and the Atlantic Council, and so we're just really honored to have you here as a part of it. You are the first.
Thank you so much for having me, and congratulations on the report. I know those reports come after weeks of work, so warmest congrats to you.
Thank you so much. So sorry, I'm pretty excited to talk with you, and I'm just excited to say that you are the first ever Deputy National Security Advisor for Cyber and Emerging Tech. Can you talk a bit about the Biden-Harris administration's approach to integrating cyber and emerging tech into broader national security discussions?
Absolutely. So increasingly we see that cyber and emerging technology have geopolitical dimensions and are used as part of geopolitical competition. So the creation of this role really highlights the priority the president places on the technology aspects of geopolitics. What do I mean? As we see, technology, emerging technologies, cyber, can increase inclusion in democratic processes, in advancing access to banking and other systems, but it can also be used as a tool by authoritarian governments to restrict access or to control messaging in a way that drives particular objectives. So the way the administration chose to both create the role but also place it in the National Security Council is significant, because the role of the National Security Council is integrating multiple tools of a government's policies, economic policies, national security policies, regional policies, in order to most effectively both promote the country's goals, our allies' goals, and as well as compete with our competitors and manage our adversaries. So integrating technology within those conversations ensures that it really is included in each of our conversations in that realm.
That's a large bill of responsibilities and thoughts. How are you balancing these different priorities in terms of your approach to cyber and emerging tech?
Absolutely. So there are 3 core lines to our work, and I'll talk through them briefly and just give an exemplar of how we're doing that. First, modernize our defenses in the realm of cyber and emerging technology to meet the threat. Second, build alliances and partnerships. This is an area of interest for so many countries. Deepen those partnerships in this realm. And finally, posture to compete effectively, particularly against authoritarian regimes who may seek to use cyber and emerging technology to advance their vision of world order. So in the modernizing defenses area, you've seen a whole host of initiatives the president's launched in his first year, from an executive order significantly improving federal government cybersecurity to highlight that we won't kick the can down the road further, to making significant improvements in software security, leveraging what we've seen is needed to address from major incidents like SolarWinds and Microsoft Exchange, to a number of major initiatives to secure US critical infrastructure. When I look to alliances and partnerships, cyber has become a major part of our work within NATO. The first cyber defense policy update in 7 years recently released, and now work on an action plan. I addressed the NAC on cyber a couple of weeks ago and got significant questions from around 20 of the countries of the group represented there. Really good questions around geopolitical aspects of technology, etc. In addition, cyber is a key part of our Quad partnership, really work we're doing together to both improve resilience of our country's technology and critical infrastructure as part of that global competition. And finally, as we talk about posturing to compete, we look carefully at technologies that are both real elements of how we compete to attract the best minds in the world as an alliance of democracies, but also how we ensure that we can consider how to manage adversaries' use of these technologies that could advance authoritarian orders that are significantly of concern to us.
Can you play this out a bit for me? When you're looking at the national security threats and priorities today, how do you see that playing out over the next 5 to 10 years?
So we truly believe that we're at a global inflection point because we're grappling with the fundamental question of how democracies really use technology to promote democratic governance and human rights, and how we consider the risks. We really have to demonstrate that democracy can deliver for its people in terms of more quickly developing and distributing vaccines, for example, in the COVID area, in terms of using technology to advance inclusion. I mentioned, for example, potential digital currencies as a key way to bring down the cost of banking or to help remittances move around in a less costly way, given how many individuals work in one country and support families overseas. And certainly climate change is a key area as well. So democratic societies like ours really have to prevent a race to the bottom by standing up with resolve against digital authoritarianism, but also kind of really promote a race to the top by showing that we can use these technologies to advance human rights, to advance the health and the well-being of our citizens as well. And that's really the core areas that's driving a lot of the policy thinking, both within the country and with our partners as well.
I think one of the things that our report takes head on is that I think we make the case that emerging tech really represents the next arena for great power competition. It sounds like you might agree with that, but I wanted to give you a chance to frame it, whether or not you feel that's the case and we need to be clear and transparent about that, or whether or not you see it differently.
We very much believe that's the case and agree very much with the report's perspective on that. And I think particularly, the report highlights and talks about how we ensure that, particularly in the area of emerging technology, we're using that to advance our vision. And I think we see it very much, particularly with China, where China has a vision of where they use technology to advance Chinese leadership and as a tool to promote their order, and also to advantage particular Chinese technology companies as part of that piece. And indeed, one of the areas that is a key part of many of our discussions with allies and partners is China using coercive economic instruments, coercive rules around intellectual property, particularly around technology, to advance that vision in a very practical way as well.
And I love that you all are very forward thinking about the positive aspects of technology and where we can take it. How do you think that we can work with our allies to really maintain technology leadership and increase our innovative capacities and address some of these challenges we're facing, particularly with misinformation and disinformation?
It's a really, misinformation and disinformation is a really complex area, right? It's a complex area that we think about. And I'll really highlight the Summit for Democracy that's very much upcoming with regard to how we thought to work closely with allies and partners in terms of maintaining really our shared leadership and our shared innovation. So the Summit for Democracy has 3 core principles, and I'll note them here. It's defending against authoritarianism, supporting democracy, one piece, fighting corruption, and protecting human rights. And really the way we brought together allies and partners to work on that within the summit in a very public way, and the series of initiatives supporting that. So you saw the principles coming out of the summit. There's really 5 key principles, and technology is at the core of each of them, as we can clearly see. First, protecting open, secure, reliable, and interoperable internet. And those are principles that we long seek to defend. They're at the core, for example, of the work we're doing on cybersecurity partnerships around the world. Because there's multiple principles there: secure, open, and interoperable. The second key principle is really protecting against the misuse of surveillance technologies. And I think you saw the designations that the Department of Commerce recently did, and the work we're seeking to do in a positive way, as you noted, right? To build that alliance of countries who say, these are the principles we will agree to abide by. Back to the point about, let's stand up for what we represent. As a key principle, it's far easier to inspire by showing what we stand for than to really, while we do have to call out behaviors or processes that aren't appropriate, it's more important to us to stand up and build and have that alliance that we've had for so many years. The third is really principles, the proliferation against internet shutdowns, the use of authoritarian governments of shutdowns to really cut communications. And I think the core message there is that in democracies, we don't necessarily support all the communications that we see happening, right? We all can have views, and we can have strong differences of views. But in democracies, we can debate ideas in a healthy way, and we don't feel the fear of ideas that we may not necessarily agree with, and thus the need to, cut communications, as we've seen, just happen more and more. Fourth, we'll continue to look for opportunities and ideas to invest in cutting-edge technologies, such as privacy-preserving machine learning. It's a really interesting approach, privacy-preserving machine learning and encryption, technologies that allow us to protect privacy, but also gain the benefits of big data. I have a good friend who had an ill child with a version of cancer that was just very rare around the world. The ability to both protect that individual's privacy, but still learn the lessons of rare diseases and bring together side effects of drugs is something we all know we need to do. We want both. We want to protect patients' privacy, but also gain the benefits of machine learning and big data in that way. And finally, we truly think it's imperative to bridge the digital divide. And that's both with humility in the United States and around the world. So you've seen in the President's budget in the US, where the expansion of broadband access, to recognize that individuals who live in rural communities, where for economic purposes it's harder sometimes for telecom companies to really expand access, we're saying it's really a right. Everybody needs to have the access and the speed of access to learn online, to transact online, and then globally around the world in the B3W, Build Back Better World initiative, where we try to kind of bridge that digital divide globally around the world as well, with high standards-based digital communications and infrastructure as well.
So how can democracies showcase that their system is better, so to speak, than authoritarian regimes, which do have more access to data and aren't necessarily slowed down by compromise finding procedures? So in some ways, they seem to be winning, as Anne Applebaum recently put it in the Atlantic's cover story. Tell me a bit more about that. How can we really showcase it, that democracies work better in this area?
So Anne's article was really a good article, and I had to read it a couple of times, in articles that you need to read once and then read again to really reflect on the core message. And I think the core way, to look at winning is in some of the facts around people and technologies. So first, around people. Are democracies continuing to attract the best minds from all around the world because people feel that they're human, their identities as people are respected there, the great ideas they have, their intellectual property is respected there, and if they become, indeed, they take their ideas and build a company, the IP of their companies and their ability to attract global players around the world and global customers are protected as well. And I think on that, democracies are winning and need to continue to, in terms of immigration to democratic countries, the desire for people who really want to lead and innovate and just pursue better lives to come to democracies. I think the second, and this is where the test will be for us, is on technology. And I think some of the work that's been done by individual companies who have released responsible use of AI, ethical use of AI, to show that we can do both. We can gain the benefits of these technologies, and we can also manage the risks. And I think, I talked about AI, I'll note quantum as well. Quantum information sciences has potential huge benefit in terms of breakthroughs in areas like climate change, in terms of climate models, really the models, the mathematical models, and allowing us to process data and come to unique conclusions in many ways. Can we get those benefits? Quantum also brings some significant risks in that a cryptographically relevant quantum computer would be able to potentially break some of the core encryption that's the root of internet commerce. It's at the root of privacy protecting encryption, what we use as well as in governments to protect our most sensitive secrets. So I think for democracies to show we can win is, do we build the technology partnerships in order to gain the benefits and advance with responsible use to show we can also protect privacy and allow for inclusion. So it's not only a small elite who can use these technologies, but a broader set, but also manage for the risks in, for example, rapidly deploying quantum-resistant cryptography that can protect against the potential downsides.
Let me ask a follow-up on quantum. So how urgently do you think we need to address that technology and begin to really think about its impacts?
So I think from what we see in private sector advancements, certainly from a positive side, we're watching closely to see private sector advancements in that area, and from the risks as well. It looks to be a decade away, and that's the time frame we're looking to, but of course looking for pilot efforts that show whether it's quantum information science, whether it's quantum sensing, that the sooner there are those advancements that we can leverage for some of the examples I gave, the sooner the better.
Yeah, absolutely. Let me circle back a bit. I wanted to follow up on the need for technology leadership, and particularly when we think about data collection, how can we really address data collection and privacy and balance that with civil society concerns?
It's such a fantastic question because it's at the crux of so much that we want to think about in the realm of economics, in the realm of national security, and in the realm of human identity and privacy. We know that big data can bring together unique insights. I mentioned climate models that allow us to say, if we potentially adopt this policy, what would be the broader implications in different ecosystems, from drier ecosystems to wetter ecosystems to colder and warmer ecosystems, right? And the ability to really bring together data, build those models, and frankly, update those models as new data comes in is incredibly powerful. There are tremendous risks of big data as well, right? The combination of information about an individual, bringing together that with their geolocation to potentially, we've seen how that has been used in some countries to form mobs that can pursue individuals who may have different ideas, practice a different faith, or be of particular ethnic groups. So I think it's at the crux of the inflection we're at as democracies of showing that we can do both, gain the benefits while managing the risks. And I think some of the ways we do that, for example, by considering, can systems answer questions while managing what data is retained in a careful way so that we gain the benefits while protecting from those risks? What's an example? I think as we look at the field of digital identities, that's a really interesting area. We see a huge amount of fraud online, and we see it sometimes affecting the most vulnerable populations. Yet we have significant concerns about digital identities in terms of privacy, in terms of government tracking an individual's purchases and individual's presence. So I took a trip recently to India, and I intentionally asked to do a detailed briefing on their Aadhaar, their national digital identity system. And I was struck by the very intentional way people thought about some of these questions, and it offered some lessons for us to consider. For example, the system did yes/no questions. Is this individual? Instead of returning a lot of data about the individual. Similarly, the system didn't retain information about who was pressing the question, who was asking. Was it a was it a company somebody was shopping at, where it was, etc. So I think considering these questions at the outset to ensure that the amount of data that is retained, the queries that could be asked, the purposes in terms of tracking who has the rights to ask what kind of questions, can help us think about privacy-preserving systems that also drive the benefits we need from big data to achieve the advancements in the medical field, in health field, in national security fields, and of course in economic growth as well in many ways.
Absolutely. And where do private-public partnerships in tech stand today? And what's the administration's position on where they should be headed in the future?
It's such a good question, and it's often helpful to speak to examples that highlight the attributes of what can work in this space. And I'll use we've been talking a lot about emerging tech, so I'll use one in the cybersecurity realm. Multiple countries are grappling with cybersecurity of critical infrastructure. In the United States, this has been a key issue after the ransomware attacks against a major regional pipeline, against a meatpacking company, against a technology company that could be used to distribute ransomware broadly. It's certainly been an issue. We saw Ireland's healthcare system. Ransomware is a great example that's really brought to the fore cybersecurity risks to critical infrastructure. And yet, to your question, in most countries, critical infrastructure, telecom, power, water, is owned and operated by the private sector. And for 10 years, we've looked to public-private partnership models that I think many countries look to and say, do we need to go further? Do we need mandates for cybersecurity? In the United States, we've really pushed hard on the public-private partnership model in the President's Industrial Control Systems Initiative. We will shortly be rolling out the third sector. We started with utilities, then pipelines. Will shortly be rolling out water. And I'll highlight the attributes of that public-private partnership. First, we identified the really key companies in the sector, and I'll use utilities. Companies that serve 50,000 or more Americans or serve a national security site. In the US, there are sometimes remote bases that serve that. And we brought them in, provided them classified threat briefings, so everybody was operating from the same context, instead of two camps exchanging information that was operating from a different context. And then we discussed the key threats. The key threats we're most concerned about are, as we observed in some attacks, systems that shut down operational systems, an operational pipeline that's where oil is moving quickly. And we gained agreement on the type of technologies that would prevent that. And then the companies voluntarily rolled out those technologies. Today, 150 utilities, for example, in just that first 100-day spin, rolled out industrial control systems technologies that serve 90 million Americans. Pipelines, as I noted, water in the same. So that's an example of what has been a successful public-private partnership and one we seek now to build on. But there were some key attributes that I think are at the root of what makes such efforts successful, and the back and forth and genuinely listening and adjusting the program based on input from all participants is really key.
Yeah, absolutely. A variety of issues like climate change will require global cooperation, including with China and Russia. Where do you see the opportunities for a compete, cooperate, and confront approach in the technology realm?
It's really a good point. And first, we have to outcompete at home. In terms of our investments in innovation. The President's talked about the low levels of research and technology the US was at. And I think doubling down on that R&D, as you've seen in Build Back Better initiatives and others, including, for example, the Bill on the Hill, the CHIPS Act with regard to major investments in microelectronics. So it begins at home in terms of, in each of our countries, building the innovation, the support for innovation, the attractive policies that brings the best minds, and the partnerships with our key allies and partners in order to do so. And then I'll echo the President's words, which I had here. We'll cooperate where we can, compete where we should, and confront where we must. So we cooperate on technology standards to address those standards, to develop those standards, and to address transnational threats. And I think you see deeper and deeper really cooperation in those technology standards, and you highlighted a few, for example, in responsible use of AI. In competing in the technology space, I'll look at 5G, right, where we wanted to offer a competitive model. And you saw the diversity principles that were recently announced at the Prague summit, where we did that with allies and partners to say, in order to compete with authoritarian models, with technologies from countries who may place very burdensome questions or very intrusive questions around data collected in those systems, we need to. And then finally, on confront, we'll confront countries that seek to close technological gaps by theft of intellectual property or by coercive policies to try to retain intellectual property or demand transfer of that property as part of doing work in those countries.
And particularly in the AI and emerging tech realms, are there attempts to put in these guardrails, and if so, that will allow for healthy competition while mitigating the risk for escalation? And if so, what are they?
That's an area that we are thinking through very carefully because it's such a new space and it's so at the crux of it. And we talked about a few different areas. Healthy competition first in terms of thinking through standards that promote our model, promote our democratic model, building alliances with other countries, and then working together to advance those models. I think in the technology space, certainly so. But it's also in the cyber arena, where there are a set of international norms signed off by the United Nations, governmental group of experts, around responsible use of cyberspace. For example, countries will hold countries accountable for criminal activity, state or nation state, so certainly nation state criminal activity, as well as national activity coming from within their borders. While the norms exist, they're often not implemented in terms of consequences. Some of the consequences, for example, are attribution, when there is irresponsible activity by nation states. And I think you've seen in the first year of the Biden administration really two significant kind of communal attribution of irresponsible use of cyberspace, the SolarWinds incident and China's Microsoft Exchange incident. And the US worked to build a broader coalition than ever before, including NATO and the European Union, to say broad compromise in the Microsoft Exchange case of thousands of servers around the world. And when we talk about email servers, we think about the amount of data there as well. That's irresponsible use. And thus, we will call it out in line with starting to implement those norms in cyberspace, because it is a global commons, it is a global community, and thus, as a community of like-minded nations, we can both articulate what is responsible use and call out and enforce when we see irresponsible use.
Thank you for that. And we actually have a couple minutes. Would you be open to taking a few questions from the audience?
Of course.
Awesome, thank you. Who would like to get us? Please, go ahead.
Thank you very much. Matthew Perrin from Salesforce. I really appreciate the comments, and the commentary on ethical use, ethical and humane use on AI is something I think we could get a lot of collaboration on. But my question really goes to the conversation on the Summit Democracies around secure, reliable, and interoperable internet. So how would the US administration view the investments my company's making in things like the EU operating zone or Microsoft's investment in their so-called EU data boundary cloud, which basically allows for data storage and data processing to be exclusively done in the EU and doesn't allow data to transfer back to the United States? How do we think about that from an administration perspective as well as like from a transatlantic alliance point of view?
It's a really good question that's at the crux of really the question that you asked earlier regarding data and the lines between how do we achieve the benefits of data, big data, and the insights we get from that, and also how do countries achieve their concerns regarding competition, their concerns regarding national security, particularly of their citizens' data. And from a US perspective, secure, open, and interoperable, we believe that it's possible to protect citizens' data and achieve really healthy competition around data, while to achieve both goals together. And I think we've been having intense discussions with the European Union about how we can work together to ensure the European Union's goals for privacy and for competition are very much achieved, while also ensuring both the European Union and the United States and all allies, democratic allies, achieve the benefits that come from bringing data together in a protected way. I used earlier the example of side effects from vaccines in specific populations. And I chose that one intentionally because clearly if we want to build bespoke models that give us unique insights in areas where the more data, the richer the insights, there needs to be a way to do that in a way that protects privacy. So that's why privacy-protecting machine learning models, homomorphic encryption, where potentially we can use encrypted data but also gain the insights, are areas where I think we can be making joint US-EU investments to advantage that area to see if we can achieve both.
I think we have time for one more question. Greg.
Hi, good morning, everybody. My name is Greg Johnson. A couple of thoughts. Right now, as we're having this conference, there's congressional hearings on the Hill regarding some of the titans of cryptocurrency and so forth. And I'd just be interested in some of your comments on the overlap between national security, central bank digital currencies. These are all intertwined. And I think these are important topics as we maybe navigate through the rest of the agenda today, too, just to keep in the back of our minds. And thank you very much. This has been terrific so far this morning. Well
You're
done.
welcome. I'm smiling because we've been putting a lot of time into the topic of cryptocurrency as central bank digital currency. So it's cool to be in an environment where individuals are thinking about and talking about, right, the future of technology in such a rich way. So first, cryptocurrency has, in each of these technology areas, huge potential advancements in inclusion, in economic growth, in just cool impacts to quality of life. And our goal in all of our policy decisions is maximizing that while managing for the risks, right? So in a part of my day job, being brutally candid, ransomware is fueled by cryptocurrency, right? Criminals, it's a fundamentally an profitable enterprise, and the ease with which cryptocurrency allows movements of money around the world, and increasingly anonymity-enhancing cryptocurrencies like Monero versus the very open blockchain can really fuel that. And one of the reasons we've put such a focus on putting in place anti-money laundering principles, both in the United States, as well as pressing for them globally, the International Counter-Ransomware Initiative we hosted at the White House had one of its 4 lines of effort around advancing anti-money laundering rules in the area of cryptocurrency, building capacity with allies and partners around the world, 31 countries plus the EU participating. And one core takeaway was all noted that anti-money laundering rules are really not implemented in cryptocurrencies the way they are in fiat currencies. It's an area where we can do real work together, and we are. Managing those risks enables us to get the benefits. So in our policy areas that we're thinking about is, what are the potential areas that we can gain the benefits of those innovations? That's in the routine cryptocurrency, stablecoin areas. With regard to a central bank digital currency, we certainly have seen that many countries are making advancement in that area. The digital yuan is certainly, and the potential for countries to then, when they make advances, to then set the global standards, to then set the models is significant. And as I noted earlier in response to the question you asked, we truly believe that in democracies, we can advance in technology while also managing the risks. A central bank digital currency is a great example. It can be used by a government to track, where individuals are spending money, where physically they are. It can also be used, as I talked about, to advantage positive aspects. Global remittances is one of the use cases we're thinking about a lot. It costs a lot of money to move money around the world, and there are a lot of immigrants or laborers who work in one country and support a family back home. Cryptocurrency, a central bank digital currency that has the power of a country, giving credibility to the currency so the value doesn't go down abruptly, can really advantage that. So thinking through how we do so while managing the risk is a hot area of policy development, a hot area of discussions on the Hill, and really an area that we hope you'll see, near-term policy outcomes in the next number of months coming out of the administration. Thank you.
And Anne, thank you so much for being with us today. It's an incredible conversation. We appreciate it.
Thank you. And thanks again for the report.
Thank you very much, Deputy National Security Advisor and Stephanie. Ladies and gentlemen, that was a lot of food for thought. Now I have 2 videos between you and your lunch. First of all, we have a short video from our friends at the Smithsonian. And I understand here is somebody from Smithsonian. Can you stand up that people then can talk with you over the lunch? And then we have another video from a top-end Finnish technology company, Varjo, which is leading in VR and XR. And we have people from Varjo here. They will be behind that wall because during lunch, anybody who would like can test their VR capabilities in there too. So we will run these 2 videos, and then we will have lunch, which is served straight behind you. And we will reconvene at 12:30. And I have to remind that's 12:30 with Finnish punctuality, which means that you are sitting down at 12:29 and wondering why I'm not here talking to you already. So with that thought, we play a couple of videos, and then please enjoy your lunch.
Our dream is to move beyond a simulated experience to a real experience, where we remove any negative training entirely and recreate the exact feeling and conditions of the most mission-critical scenarios.
For many years, our industry has sort of been reluctant to dive deep into the XR solutions. The challenge has been to accurately replicate high-pressure environments that are emotionally engaging for the users.
High fidelity is critical for effective mixed reality training for pilots. With the Vario XR3, the realism in the field of view is further increased and prepared, which removes negative training when recreating conditions of the most mission-critical scenarios.
Vario's new full-frame bionic display, with its wide and natural field of view and its mind-opening human eye resolution, is the perfect key for our extensive design work in XR. The advanced depth sensing and LiDAR should give us the possibility to merge the real and the virtual, enabling a fully immersive experience and natural body-hand object occlusion.
Vario has pushed the boundaries of high-resolution mixed reality. By working with Vario, Unity continues to power the next level of photorealism and immersion for industrial design, simulation, training, and more.
Using their own hands and medical equipment takes our healthcare providers to a more immersive emotional state, achieving a higher level of focus that could ultimately save lives.
Unreal Engine, coupled with Vario headset, has allowed users to power some of the most demanding use cases of immersive technology. The new XR3 and VR3 allows creators to explore the next frontier of immersion using the unprecedented level of visual performance.
So ladies and gentlemen, I hope you enjoyed good conversations during the lunch break. We now turn to the afternoon session of the seminar, and to start with, we get a sneak peek to the future of technology and connectivity with a presentation on video on 6G and how that will change connectivity. And that presentation is from a real American institution, the Bell Labs, which of course nowadays is owned by Nokia from Finland. So Peter Vedder, the president of Core Research from Nokia Bell Labs. Thank you.
Thanks for having me, and thanks for letting us share our vision on 6G. And as the animation shows in this title slide, it will have to do a lot with how augmented intelligence will influence the way we design future network and the way we design future applications. But before talking about the new generation of 6G, which is still 10 years out, we talk about 2030s, let me give a bit of a historical perspective. Already since the 80s, our industry has been very good at turning out a new generation of mobile networks every 10 years. And with every generation, we came up with new radio technologies, going for higher and higher frequencies and wider spectral bands with the goal to enhance the capacity. With every generation, we also had new compute platforms and new network platforms. New compute platforms that enabled new applications and new network platforms that leverage these new compute platforms. I think of the 80s of mainframe computers in IBM and VAX computers, then the PCs, the laptops, and then for 4G, we saw the paradigm shift of the cloud in the previous decade. In 5G, we will see the distributed cloud with compute capabilities very close to the end devices, because for the first time in 5G, we're connecting machines that have a much faster response time than humans. And so we need control applications very close to the end devices. Now, in addition to these three attributes, every generation is also defined by a new application. Generation 1 and 2 very much were defined by enabling human mobility, connectivity for voice communication. 3G and 4G unleashed the potential of information and social media. And then 5G unleashed the potential of industrial IoT, industrial Internet of Things, and industrial automation with connecting machines. And every generation also had its unexpected applications that you can read for yourself, and I give a beer for the person who tells me what the unexpected application is in 5G. But talking about 6G, which is, according to this 10-year cycle, still a decade out, we already start thinking of what do we need to do research on each of these dimensions. In 6G, on the mobile radio technologies, we already start exploring new frequency ranges that go from millimeter wave to the near terahertz range. And we anticipate that the new compute platforms will be very much enabled by AI, ML, augmented intelligence and machine learning, which will not only define the way we enable applications, but also the way we design the network. And then the defining applications will be very much around connecting the human world and the physical world with digital twins in a digital world. And that will very much empower new human possibilities. And let me explain that a little bit more with the net view graph. And so 5G has connected humans and machines. What we expect in 6G is a massive scale deployment of sensors, and that will continuously update the state of the physical world, the state of our own human world, with the digital world. And in these digital models in the digital world, we will then have the ability to predict possible future outcomes, anticipate needs, and then orchestrate actions to enhance our human lives. These digital twin models, for instance, allow also for transporting these models to a different location in real time. A model of myself will be transported to you and recreated in a holographic representation, as if I were there with you. Now, these digital twins already exist in a precursor way in 5G. We see digital twins in industrial automation, digital twins that enable to predict failures in machines and allow for repairs before the failure happens, or allow for the proper scheduling of maintenance. We can also expect digital twins in the wide area networks of cities, or digital twins of ourselves, enabling, for instance, better healthcare. Now, that will have a profound impact on the way we deploy the future network. And you see at the bottom of this view graph a simplified representation of that network. You see on the left-hand side the users in a private setting at homes or in enterprises, and then connected through wireless and wireline network, fixed networks, with what we call an any-hall network that connects that with the edge cloud. There we have compute capabilities, storage capabilities, network capabilities, AI in future, and also security capabilities. And that edge cloud is then connected with the central cloud through an IP optical transport fabric. Now in future, we see this massive scale deployment of sensors that will generate an enormous amount of upstream traffic to update the digital twin models distributed across that infrastructure. And these digital twin models, you can think of them as 3D models, but also as very abstract, self-learned AI/ML models that represent instances that they're continuously learning in the real world. These models also update each other. We often think of this as the new killer application that will generate enormous capacity in that future network and will have special requirements for that future network. So in order to prepare for that 6G era, we see 6 key research areas to enable the essential infrastructure. Let me start on the left with the architecture, the network architecture. A future network will be completely cloudified. Like we have cloud applications today that provide a lot of agility and scalability on any compute resource in data centers distributed, as we call, in the cloud. And so we want that same agility also with future network infrastructure, and then expose that and deploy it as a service, just like we do with cloud applications today. Now, with that, we will also see the use of AI/ML to completely automate that deployment of that future network. Very complex network with very specialized requirements that will set up a service in an instance thanks to AI/ML. AI/ML that will also allow to design new air interfaces, 2 endpoints, a radio station and a handset that will figure out by itself how to most optimally communicate. We are doing research on new radio technologies, like in the terahertz range, but also in the existing frequency bands, in the C-band, like we have it today, but with higher capacity, more spectrum efficiency, and doing that at a lower energy in a more sustainable way. And allowing that network with the radios not only for communication, but this ubiquitous availability of radio to use that also as a sensing modality. Think of it as a radar that senses the presence of humans, that senses the presence of machines and robots and cars, and apply AI/ML to that sensing and understand what is happening. We sometimes call that a network with a sixth sense. Now, if so much information is gathered and sent across that infrastructure, you also want an infrastructure that you can trust. So security is very much a research concern that we are taking very serious. In 5G, security was a bit designed in as an afterthought. In 6G, we want to bring in this security from the ground up. And we talk about very extreme network requirements. A network of networks where the endpoint is again a network, a body area network, a machine area network, a car area network with very specialized requirements. Also, the network of networks as in satellite networks that provide redundancy and extra coverage in combination with the terrestrial network. So I hope in this short talk you can appreciate the many research challenges that we are addressing, and I hope I provided you a bit of food of thought for the discussions at your event. Thank you for your attention.
All right, thank you to Nokia for that video. And now I'm very excited to hand it over to our final panel of the day. I'm going to pass the mic to Ryan Heath, who's going to be moderating, and I'll let you take it away. It's going to be a great conversation.
Great. And hi, everyone. I'm from Politico. I do the global insider newsletter there, and it's now a weekly podcast too. So I obviously encourage you all to sign up. I'll do some brief introductions of the panelists, and then we'll get into it. Matti Anttinen here on my right. I just heard you described as the Wendy Sherman of Finland. Do you accept the label?
Yeah.
Excellent. And you were previously ambassador to Sweden for Finland, and my family 100 years ago were Swedish-speaking Finns, so I appreciate the CV. Next, we have April Falcon-Doss, who's Executive Director of the Institute of Technology, Law and Policy at Georgetown University, and you are a cyber privacy author, so I think we're going to dig into that a little bit in the discussion as well. Welcome. I'm obviously a senior official at the National Security Agency before all of that. And I think Fred Kemp at the end here doesn't need much of an introduction for this audience, but he is President and Chief Executive Officer here at the Atlantic Council. And what I found out doing digging before this panel, European Voice, which was the predecessor publication to Politico Europe, named you one of the top 4 journalists in all of Europe in 2002. And I think that's from your legacy at the Wall Street Journal, 30 years running a lot of bureaus and doing a lot of great work there.
But they forgot to do fact checking because they also named me one of the top 50 Europeans. And of course, I'm not a European, but anyway, it was nice.
Excellent.
I'm sure the fact checking's improved at Politico.
Yes. Well, we're here to talk about leveraging tech opportunities for the 21st century. And I wanted to start at the 30,000-foot level, and then we can dig into some of those more difficult discussions around tech nationalism, regulation, and so on. So my question to each of you is what you see as the top tech opportunities, but I'll ask you to also nominate a danger, because I think we've lived through this era of tech optimism, and I'm not going to deny opportunity, but I want us to sort of have a realistic view about where we are. I'll start with you, Matti.
What I'm most optimistic is what most likely we are going to find, solutions for the climate questions. Many of those solutions are already there. They just have to be applied, and we talked about earlier about the regulation that the governments have to set a goal, set the route, and then the economic operators will follow that direction if they know that where to go. So whether it's kind of energy saving, energy efficiency, renewables, I think most of those solutions are there. Now we just have to apply, and therefore it's easy to be optimistic. Then what I'm less optimistic about is everything when it comes to the cybersecurity, because we are going to have more cybercrime. We are going to have more state actors who are using the cybersphere for their own uses. And even though we are going to, I think all countries, European, America, is going to take a lot of efforts to tackle those questions. I don't think we will be 100% successful. So not a reason to be very optimistic, but I think we are going to work on it. But I think there will be big challenges in the future as well.
April.
Well, you had to start with the hard question first. Climate is such a perfect example, I think, of both the challenges and opportunities in technology. Even looking at the narrow realm of artificial intelligence in the climate crisis, AI is both used to model changes and solutions, and also in the hardware and underlying manufacturing stream of AI and the energy consumption can exacerbate climate change. So I think on all these issues of technology, what we find are this duality. So I think that when we look at the transformation of the workplace, digital technologies in particular have the opportunity not only to greatly expand freedom of movement, which can shift political landscapes, which can foster opportunity of all kinds. We also see the opportunity for really intrusive uses of technology in the workplace, which is something I hope we'll get a chance to talk about in terms of the dangers, because some of those dangers are coming from unexpected places. Certainly cybersecurity and personal data and data protection and data privacy have to be at the top, I think, of any list of both challenges and opportunities. The risks, of course, are overreach of surveillance by governments as well as corporations. But really, I think the biggest risk in this area is around the undermining of individual autonomy. You know, when you think about the ways in which digital technologies tailored towards our own individual interests not only hijack our attention, but redirect our thinking down paths we weren't intending to follow. You know, my big worry is, you know, not whether computers will be able to pass the Turing test, but whether in 10 or 20 years, people will be able to pass the Turing test, right? So I've given you more pessimism than optimism.
I'm scared
so I'll just stop there.
I'm a natural contrarian, so that worries me.
Yeah.
Fred, how about you?
Ryan, first of all, just great that you're moderating this panel. And I want to thank the ambassador, and I want to thank Mr. Secretary. What a beautiful setting. This is just fantastic. So I want to pick up on what both of you have said, and particularly, April, what you said about surveillance. The biggest danger is techno-authoritarianism. Never have authoritarians had the tools to control people that they have now, and that will only increase as the technology develops, whether it's AI, whether it's quantum, and that's really the heart of the whole GeoTech Center at the Atlantic Council is looking after technology for good, but the flip side of that is technology for bad. That's technology for bad. So technology for good would be a techno-enlightenment. So I think the danger is a techno-authoritarian surge, which we're seeing. And the opportunity is techno-enlightenment to a certain extent we're also seeing. In medicine, as you said, in climate, if there's going to be a cure to climate, I'm not sure it's going to be so much carbon pricing as it's going to be technology. And the spread of knowledge, the access of knowledge in places that didn't have it before, the fact that you could address poverty in a much better way than ever before. And that's the really daunting thing about these technologies is we used to think that, like with the internet, I grew up with the internet, and one just assumed that it was a on balance democratizing force. And what we've really learned is technology is just a tool, and it can be used for bad and good. And so that would be my simple answer. Technology authoritarianism struggling against technology enlightenment.
Well, picking up on that theme exactly, maybe I'll stick with you for a second, Fred. Can you give us sort of a baseline reality check about the level to which politics is going to sort of infuse or direct a lot of the use and the regulation of technology, in the sense that you know, we're in this strategic competition context. There's no escaping it. It can really easily tip into forms of protectionism. It can tip into forms of Cold War that aren't very productive, but it's there. So this idea that you can just have like a Wild West sort of 30 years ago Silicon Valley style type of innovation probably isn't realistic. So how should people who care about tech and using it well sort of grapple with that strategic context?
A really interesting question, and I think there is no doubt that we have to bring policymakers and technologists together as never before, because the technologists don't trust the policymakers, and the policymakers don't understand the technology. And one of the things we do try to do also in the GeoTech Center Atlantic Council is build a bridge so that can be done, so that the standards can be set in such a way that doesn't hamper innovation, but at the same time protects privacy, protects all the things that we knew and want to protect. Here's the danger. There's a piece in the Wall Street Journal today, Graham Allison and Eric Schmidt of Google, and it says that on current trajectories that China will be ahead on all the foundational technologies of the future within the next 10 years. In other words, China will take the commanding heights of technological change. The other change of language there is we've been calling in our national security documents China a near peer competitor, and Graham Allison, who I've respected a long time, is referring to China as a full spectrum competitor, and really the greatest competitor that a ruling power, if you think of the United States as a ruling power, has ever faced in its time. So that's the 2022 and beyond that we're looking at. We're coming out of COVID. We've been so focused on COVID, and I really think 2022 we wake up and we take a look at reality, and this is the reality. Now, I'm not saying that Chinese coming into the more modern world and being technologically developed is necessarily all bad. But if you look at the temptation of this surveillance state and over censorship, and the tools are there for the use of authoritarians, as I said before, that they never had. And so they will regulate. In fact, they've taken over some of the major tech companies because no one wanted Jack Ma to have more data than the Communist Party had. And so the danger is if they have the commanding heights, not only will they regulate themselves in ways we may have no influence over, they may actually take the lead in setting global standards, or at least if not in the lead, it will be contested. And so the global standards will not necessarily be looking after human rights and democracy and individual freedoms. The global standards will be either neutral toward human rights and those sorts of issues, or contrary to them. So it's really a battle not just for the commanding heights, but also a battle for who's going to write the standards you're talking about. So that's my concern. I think at the moment the standards are being written in China pretty aggressively. We're more searching for what it should be. It takes us longer in the democratic world to come to a decision, but I do think we ought to step on the gas and or the electric vehicle pedal and get things going.
That's another good tech opportunity, is electric vehicles. April, how much of it is a choice between sort of China wins or democracy wins? Is there something other than the binary that we can aim at, or the alternative, we just have fragmentation? There is no single global standard for anything, and we live in our parallel siloed worlds. How can we outthink this conundrum?
Well, that's another hard question, isn't it? So I don't envision the true fragmentation that is certainly possible. I don't envision that for the simple reason that we have such a globally interconnected economy, and even with things like, for example, data localization laws in China and areas of the world in which either there are significant choke points to internet access or areas in which there is sort of the balkanization of the internet, I don't think that we are truly going to see fragmentation at depth that creates impenetrable silos. The much greater risk is, I think, exactly what Fred pointed to, that we have a framework within which there is some level of acceptance that you get certain kinds of individual freedoms and protections in some parts of the world as opposed to others. And you know, going back to thinking about cybersecurity, for example, where the essence of risk and opportunity for defense always rests on three things: people, processes, and technologies. I think that when we look at what are the tech opportunities we can leverage for the 21st century, we certainly have to also be thinking about how do we bring people into this and how do we bring process into this. And the fact that this event is taking place sort of in the same week as the Democracy Summit, I think is perfectly timed, because a great deal of this, I think, has to come back to a set of global values and norms and how the international community can create a sense of pressure on the more authoritarian-leaning states to set some boundaries on what is acceptable in terms of state action, and also look to how the combination of regulatory and consumer-motivated pressures can be brought to bear on corporate-level actions that can be equally intrusive and harmful in different ways than state surveillance and overreach.
Mm-hmm. I was on an earlier panel with the US Chamber this morning, and CJ Mahoney from Microsoft, he was presenting the flip side in a positive way, where he's saying, actually, companies don't have to wait for governments. Like, their opportunity is to go better and further than the Department of Justice could go on some of these issues and deliver us a democratic dividend that way. Maddie, tell us about the Finland model. Like, we know that Finland is both green and digital, picking up on that climate point you made. We know Nokia was a huge heavyweight in the tech world, and now you're developing a great startup scene. Is there an overall approach that the Finnish government and Finnish businesses are working on together to deal with this?
Yes and no. Like in every market economy, the companies are, by definition, rather autonomous to do things. On the other hand, there are many things where, as I said earlier, you need regulation, you need some kind of overall idea where we should be going, and then it's much easier for the companies to go there. I think what is the biggest new thing for the government at the moment, they have set a goal for Finland to become carbon neutral by 2035. Sounds science fiction, but it's going to be done, because the private sector as a whole sees this as a kind of realizable goal, and they know where to go, towards which goal to go, and then they're going to get there. If the government would not have set that kind of goal, and it's not kind of that you company have to do this thing, the second one that thing. No, you give a kind of overall direction where we want to go. We want to get rid of coal by 29. We want to increase the renewables. We want to have more energy efficiency, but not kind of too detailed goals for the companies. And I think that works. We had heard earlier today about the European regulatory model. It might be sometimes a bit heavy-handed and a bit bureaucratic, but I think it has given in many fields a good approach. We saw this analog phone where everything started. It was actually the telecom administration of Finland, Sweden, Norway, and Denmark which created the Nordic mobile telephone system, which was then next step was GSM, and so on. So it was created by the governments. It was not created by the Ericssons and Nokias, but because the Nordic government created this kind of good environment, that's the reason we have Ericsson and Nokia, because they had to compete on this market, which was kind of basically created by the governments. So this type of cooperation there is, and I think that's a good way of cooperating. As much market as possible, and sensible regulation as possible.
Mm-hmm. Maybe to sort of progress that thought along, we can talk about the opportunity in regulation. You know, that it's often raised in tech discussions as a problem, and we talked about how the EU can be heavy-handed sometimes. And a really good example of that, the two sides of it, is the EU's data protection regulation. I was working for the EU at the time it was developed. I remember just thinking, oh my God, it's too heavy, it's going too far, it's not going to work. And I think it hasn't delivered everything that its biggest supporters wanted, but it's there, unlike US federal privacy law, which just isn't there. And you're our resident privacy expert, April. So I was wondering, you know, maybe you could take it as a standalone question or tie it into something like the new Trade and Technology Council, the transatlantic body. But what is it going to take for us to develop some kind of shared approach to privacy, call it a privacy shield, call it something else, that withstands court challenges, that provides some kind of democratic space that gives us something sort of that's worth having versus an autocrat's version of the internet?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I do want to talk about a couple of ways in which government action can serve to foster innovation as well as simply regulate and restrict activity. And so content creators and other kinds and digital literacy campaigns for public education are some things that I want to come back to. But first, specifically on the question of data protection, of course, when the GDPR took effect in 2018, huge shift for any companies doing business globally. I think there's been perhaps some misunderstanding about the extent to which that has been really a struggle for smaller and mid-sized entities to comply with if they are situated outside the EU. It's just important to be mindful of that reality. From a big policy perspective, the challenge, of course, has been that where the European Union lacks competency over national security and policing matters, of course, it is able to scrutinize the national security activities of non-EU member states, does not need to carry out the same level of scrutiny internally. So we really do have this mismatch that is at the heart of the Schrems II decision and the collapse of Privacy Shield and the ongoing negotiations around that. And I think that from a transatlantic perspective, if we really want to bridge this gap between US and European data privacy and protection models, it is going to be necessary, I think, at some point to have a bit more recognition, perhaps on the European side, that many European member nations carry out national security surveillance activities that are fundamentally similar to what the US has been so criticized for doing. And that nonetheless, it can be possible for there to be robust protection of data in transatlantic traffic. And lastly, recognizing, of course, that using commerce as a means to try to leverage US national security policy is probably not ultimately a winning game, right? It's just the wrong lever to use there. Because what we have is companies struggling to do business because they don't know how to satisfy the question from a European data protection authority who says, could your data be intercepted by the US? We don't know, right? We have no idea. So in other words, no question, the GDPR has been hugely influential around the world in data protection legislation. We certainly have seen it cross the Atlantic in the California Consumer Privacy Act and California Privacy Rights Amendments. We certainly will see, I think, continued influence of those principles as more federal privacy legislative proposals continue to come forward until something is ultimately passed by Congress. But until we find a way to work through this disconnect in which, from the European data protection standpoint, there's a desire to effectively, sort of rest determinations on national security standards when that is not a reciprocal conversation, I think we're going to continue to really struggle there. Just quickly, areas, however, where there's great opportunity for government to do things that are very, that propel momentum forward in effective ways. And getting back to our point about opportunities, we think about all the challenges of content moderation and the anti-democratic forces that have sort of co-opted a great deal of the discourse on social media and the impact that's had in elections around the world. Finland, of course, was a leader in countering disinformation through things like public education and digital literacy and other kinds of programs going back to 2014. Lots of opportunity for the government to say, we don't need to try to restrict speech by changing Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act. What we can do is we can promote the creation of new public digital literacy campaigns that will help the public be better resilient to misinformation online, help the public be better equipped to protect their own data and understand cybersecurity risks and things like that. And create, in the intellectual property space, sort of a set of approaches to copyright that are increasingly favorable to digital content creators. That's a piece of opportunity in tech that we haven't touched on and probably won't have time to, but certainly digital technologies make it possible for everyone to be a content creator. We joke about cat videos, but there is greater opportunity for expression.
A lot of people make a living of
today
cat-like
than
videos.
ever. So to your point about the technological enlightenment, much of it is a groundswell from individuals on Twitch and TikTok and
not
everywhere
necessarily
else.
cat videos, but
yes. So I'm sorry I've talked too long. I'll stop there.
The Catlantic Council.
That's
going to
right.
be a rebrand.
That's right.
Brett, I saw you making a note there. What were you making notes on?
For me, the word regulation is like a Rorschach blot. So let me respond to that. First of all, we at the Atlantic Council, I personally am great proponents of a digital, transatlantic digital marketplace. And it sounds like rhetoric, but if this could actually be done, and I think the EU could really seize the opportunity of the Biden administration, because I think you could find a great deal of commonality right now, then what better thing could you do out of a democracy summit than have the leading democracies of the day come together and create a digital marketplace around the right kind of regulation? Now we get to the right kind of regulation question, and that's a tough one, because when I was working at the Wall Street Journal in Europe, and you alluded to that earlier, I think we invented the term. We might not have, but I think we were the first out of the box to refer to the EU as a regulatory superpower. And superpowers tend not always to use their power in the wisest possible way. And so I think there's no doubt that the EU is overregulated, no doubt. And the question is, when are you handling antitrust and when are you being anti-competitive? And I think as we come together, those are the sorts of questions you have to sort out. Google, Amazon, Facebook, are they the bad guys, or are they part of the transatlantic digital marketplace that makes us more competitive around the world? I mean, it's worth asking the question. I think the question that you really got to on regulation is, what's the role of the public sector and the private sector in the future of this amazingly disruptive period of time and technology? So if we actually sat down and talked and negotiated, I think the US and EU working together wouldn't be a bad place. Canada and North America wouldn't be a bad place to, maybe NAFTA countries, EU countries coming together would not be a bad place to do that. And I think that was primarily, if you under-regulate, you lose public trust. And if you over-regulate, you kill opportunity, innovation, and jobs. And so if this would be a good opportunity to get ourselves on the same page.
Yep. Matty.
Yeah, I think what was just said about trust is extremely important, because we don't get this digital world going forward if people don't trust it. If they cannot trust that their personal data is being protected, if they cannot trust that when they're going to an internet bank that their money is safe. So how to find the kind of delicate balance between the trust, the security, and then the innovation. Between the European Union and North America, I think certain type of fragmentation is already there. We had these TTIP negotiations which were going to take a lot of that fragmentation, not of that kind of differences away. Unfortunately, we are not there. The previous administration didn't like it and killed it, and then it has not re-emerged. Which is
can it ever re-emerge as a sectoral agreement? You know, trade experts will tell you it's crazy, you can't balance the interests when you narrow it down to a sector, but surely the politics demands that people make the effort.
I think we made a good effort. It was difficult on both sides, but I think it would have been a process worth looking to the end. Then if it then would not have been possible, fine, but unfortunately it was kind of abandoned at a stage when it got really interesting. Maybe we could have made some kind of sectoral agreements, the same way we can have WTO and pluri agreements inside the WTO. So, because we are the biggest trading partners globally, Europe and the United States. And it's quite weird when I think that European Union is negotiating with India, with Australia, with New Zealand, with Mercosur. We had an agreement with Japan, Canada, Mexico, South Korea, most of African countries, most of Latin American countries, not with the most important trading partner.
Yeah. And the US is in an extreme rivalry with China, wants the EU to be closer to it and not fall into the Chinese or the middle camp, but there's nothing to bind it together.
Yeah. So, I mean, here we are, and of course that's the kind of sovereign choice of the United States to choose its trade policy. But I think it was really a pity, at least from my point of view, our point of view, that the TTIP came to nothing. Then, I think China is going to be important actor, and as was said here earlier, that they are not just stealing the kind of intellectual property and all that kind of things, but they're also creating a lot of it. And in somehow, I'll see a world where in many sectors we have three models: the Chinese one, the European one, and then the American one. And unfortunately, there's bound to be certain kind of, because they get so difficult. It's so difficult to pass the European legislation that when they have passed it, then to adjust that to something else is almost as easy as when the United States Congress and President and everybody has agreed on something and then adjust that to something else.
So then you have to talk before any of these processes begin, which we can't do for Web 2.0, but we can do for Web 3.0 and the 6G AI metaverse future that we were learning about.
Yeah, and most likely the best way of tackling these things is that we are trying to tackle rather small individual questions. If we try to make it too wide, I think that will be very difficult before and even more difficult after we have passed the legislation either side of the Atlantic.
We've got one model for that dialogue, the Trade and Technology Council, that's just starting up. Are there other promising models or partnership approaches that you think could build trust or eliminate the risk of this discoupling? You know, we see there's a Trusted Cloud Alliance, there's a Global Data Alliance, these are industry initiatives. Are there other models that you think could help us avoid sort of these splits? And to all of you as well.
Trade and Technology Council is just started. Let us have some time for it to develop. We are too eager to get all the time new things. I think we should be working much more and harder on those things we have, because you know, just inventing every 4 years something new, I would much prefer to try to figure out the solutions and then work for them. I mean, we are going to be also each other's most important partners in the future, and there has to be something to be done for the civil servants in 2500 as well.
There are other promising models or dialogues that you think we should be making bets on?
You probably know more about that. In this area, it's not the fact that they don't just jump to your mind means we have to work to create them. I think the Secretary was saying, and he and I had a conversation earlier, there's a lot of rhetoric about what we should do, and to a certain extent we now really have to have results, and results sometimes isn't so sexy. And so whether it's picking a sector or whether it's picking a larger, audacious digital marketplace, we have to have the political signal that this has to be done. We cannot fritter around any longer. And then one has to go from that rhetoric to an actual negotiation that brings you an actual outcome. But I don't know, April, do you see anything as an example of what's working well or could be a model to be built upon? They probably are out there, they just don't pop to my mind.
Yeah, I'm looking for more civil society engagement to try to help bolster the conversations that are taking place. There's, as you point out, lots of trade industry councils and associations that are looking at these issues. We have the new sort of trade negotiation framework and on an intergovernmental sense. So now I think it's probably up to civil society and academia to see how we can continue to
This is a
expand those
totally different
conversations.
model, April, but is there, I mean, if you look at, in its time, ICON, I mean, that really, I mean, it really set the internet up for a remarkable period of development and growth in a way that was a set of rules that everyone more or less abided by, but didn't foresee some of the dangers we would go to, but it couldn't have at that time. I don't know whether maybe that's a model.
Yeah. That gives us all something to think about, doesn't it?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And is there anything, and I promise I will bring in an audience question immediately after this, what could a government or private actor, a philanthropist or someone else do to incentivize or create the compensation structures to allow more smart people who are interested in tech or who are tech specialists to perform those functions inside government, or to be the civil society voice that helps keep this world accountable? Because right now, all the financial incentives are to take the highest bid inside a tech company rather than to fill out that ecosystem. And I don't know if we can change that from any top or sideways approach, but I'm interested if you think there's a way to do it.
That's
so that we end up with more civic tech, let's say.
Yeah, so that is a great question, and you know, I mean, certainly we're seeing an increasing awareness in places like on the Hill. You know, programs to bring in technologists to, you know, support members and lead to better legislation and close that understanding gap you were talking about. And we certainly hear a lot of conversation in government about trying to create a greater ability for civil servants to sort of move in and out of government and the private sector. What can be done to help accelerate that or support that? Certainly it's possible to imagine grant programs that close funding gaps so that you can have people do, you know, kind of do tours on fellowships that place them within government for periods of time. But it does, I think, very much have to be a cross-pollination of effort. And it really does, I think, also have to include an expansion of the tech-educated workforce. I mean, that's not a new challenge. It's one that's, I think, well known. And that tech-educated workforce has to be people who are comfortable working in interdisciplinary and cross-functional ways, you know, across technology and policy and law and business operations and manufacturing and all of the things that come into play. So part of it is simply a need for expansion of educational opportunities within traditional school systems and in retraining programs, which I think, you know, we touched on a little bit in one of the earlier conversations.
Any other reactions, or I'll go to an audience question? Okay. Who's got a question in the audience? Yes, please. And if you just introduce yourself to the panelists.
Thank you. My name is Ashley Lund, and I was just wondering, in regard to government-created initiatives, such as Finland's carbon neutrality by 2035. What would you say the role of the EU antitrust environment has in incentivizing competition among companies in order to meet these goals? And do you see any opportunities for the US to learn from this type of approach with government-created initiatives?
I think the United States has a rather similar kind of a goal, just 2050. Of course, when the starting point is so different, I think that's in a way realistic, because that kind of goals, they have to be realistic. If they're not, people lose faith, and then things don't get done. So I think it's very important that you have ambitious but realistic goals. And then it varies a lot from one country to another. Then when you work in a rather small, rather homogeneous country with one language or 1.5 language, we have a Swedish-speaking minority, 5% of the population, but basically sharing the same values and the same culture, it is quite a lot easier to work towards a single goal than in a big multinational country. But I think when thinking about how to incentivize you need a discussion inside the society. You need some kind of consensus that we want to go there, because if there's a risk that the next administration will take totally a different view, then it's rather difficult for the companies to be consistent with their policies when they don't really know, when they cannot trust that, or if they cannot trust that that policy will change. So I think that's in a way important as well. But it's also the local level. It's the universities. It's the civic society. When there is a wide consensus, you get also the solutions which are there. We talked during the luncheon about environmental questions. How I see them, you need the energy solution, a better one, which we have now, more renewable, more at least less carbon. You need better materials, which are less carbon materials. You can produce them using renewable raw material. You can increase energy efficiency a lot. There's a big lift manufacturer in Finland, Nokia, Kone, slip of tongue, and they have decreased the electricity consumption of lifts by 90%. I mean, in many sectors, you can really decrease the use of water, electricity, heat, and materials.
And that's presumably directly tech-driven in lots of ways.
Yes,
the sensors, the 5G networks.
We're talking too much about the Paris Agreement, kind of the political agreement. We need also the technological solutions for those. But without that kind of a clear goal, it's useless for the companies to invest in better technologies if they are not being rewarded for that. And if there is a very strong demand from the society's point of view, and there the academia, civic society play a big role, that it helps to create that demand, then the companies will provide those products. And that then again helps the process forward. Not very easy, but we have all our share to do there.
We're getting close to the end of time. I've got one more question here, gentleman in the blue suit.
Thank you all. The first thing I would say is that AAAS, or Science Magazine, does do a Science and Technology Policy Fellowship, where they take PhDs in science and engineering and put them into the government for 2 years to work. I'm a former fellow, so that's my quick plug to that. But my question to you all is, as we bring folks on to the internet, right? So the digital divide, we're bridging that digital divide. How do you see this? We're making these standards and these rules for those folks that don't necessarily even understand the internet yet. What is the gap? What is the liaison between those folks coming on the internet and them understanding what their digital identity may become?
Who wants to take that first?
So it's a fabulous question. And one of the things that I think is so critical in this data-driven world that we all live in is that public service announcement, public digital literacy campaign kind of effort. The digital divide is something that within the US has crippling impact in communities that have fewer economic resources, whether those are urban or rural communities. And in some cases, it's the resources to literally have devices to connect to the internet. In some cases, it's access to high-speed internet connectivity. And it's extraordinarily difficult for people who are just emerging into this sort of digital landscape to easily understand what their personal risk is, how their data is being used, why they might care about that. I would love to see a schoolhouse rock for personal data and online presence. That's actually one of the things I've been thinking about. How do we create that, so that for every school child and senior citizen who just happens to be flipping through channels on their cable TV or scrolling through their news feed on whatever their preferred social media apps are, they're seeing pop up this content that provides that education.
Matti, and then a final word from Fred.
Very important question. As I mentioned earlier, about 4 billion people globally are not connected. For us, difficult to understand by the fact of life, and we should get them connected. But then at the same time, when we get them connected, it's a certain risk that connectivity is being used for also other purposes we would like to see. But I mean, we cannot avoid that risk, but that's one big thing. We need a lot of private investments in order to have these people connected. But then there are questions which are not so obvious here in the United States. That much of the internet is in English. Most of the people in the world have zero English and will have zero English. What does it mean for them? What kind of possibilities to access to information they have if they don't have this most common language in the internet? I have no solution, but I think it's always important to keep that in mind, because in this country people tend to believe that English, everybody understands it, but most people don't. And then a third point connected to this is that when we think of the African continent, very close neighbor of Europe, if you cross the Gibraltar, is 15 kilometers from Spain, is Africa. So it's not somewhere far away, it's close. It's the only continent where we'll still have a very fast population growth. We will have countries where it's not a population pyramid, but it's kind of a flat pyramid, so that the lower parts are even wider than a normal pyramid. So how do we think we are going to educate those people, give them the skills, if we are not using the modern technologies and possibilities given by the internet and digitalization? I think no way. Because we are not going to build so many schools and educate so many teachers so quickly that these people can have those opportunities. And I think if there's one big thing for us, this is it.
Final thought from you, Fred.
Yeah, I want to come back to the question you raised before you went to the audience, which is what can business do, what can individuals do? There's gray areas in use of technology, there's gray areas in regulation, but there are bad things and there are good things. And I think that individual actors, businesses, whether it's Elon Musk or others, they really have to ask themselves, in the dealings I'm doing, whether it's through my private equity or whether it's through my investments or whether anything else, am I empowering use of technology that is leading to the repression of individuals, etc.? I'm not expert enough to figure out what those lines are and where they should be, but I think people ought to be asking that ESG has to include another letter. I don't know what the letter is, but I think it has to be related to the improper use of these futuristic technologies, not for the cause of empowering us, but really for the cause of techno-authoritarianism. So I wanted to go back to that question because I had that in me and I almost wanted to say it then. But I think this is a period of time where it may not be a zero-sum test, but there certainly are right and wrong ways, and we're going to find them in our own societies as well. And so I would be in favor of that.
I would endorse it. Fred, April, Matty, thank you very much for your contributions. I learned a lot. Thank you to all of you in the audience, and thank you to everyone who joined online for this panel. We're now going to move into the workshop session. Thank you very much.
The rise of artificial intelligence promises a better tomorrow, but it also raises serious concerns. It is for this reason we believe as members of Gen Z that artificial intelligence, also known as AI, should be the greatest priority for transatlantic technology cooperation. Oracle defines AI as systems or machines that mimic human intelligence to perform tasks and that can iteratively improve themselves based on the information they collect. AI's ability to utilize tremendous volumes of data makes it a versatile tool for innumerable situations. We will be focusing on two areas that AI can impact: climate change and national security. First, climate change.
Climate change is a global and possibly existential threat that raises concerns regarding forced migration, food scarcity, economic collapse, and a substantial number of other issues. AI would be an invaluable tool to fighting climate change in a host of ways. For example, Microsoft has created smart grids, which are electrical grids that use AI to respond to changes in demand for electricity. This reduces excess load on already overtaxed electrical systems and allows for efficient provision of electricity. AI can also help us predict and model future weather events, which can create earlier warning notices and reduce damage and loss of life. This technology can also inform the creation of new products and services to mitigate the human impact on the environment. Although AI alone cannot end climate change, it is an exceptional asset in mitigating its effects.
Second, artificial intelligence is essential to national security, but the military applications of AI must be the subject of dialogue and cooperation by the world's leading democracies to ensure peaceful transition into an AI future. Gary Grossman, the global lead of the Edelman AI Center of Excellence, warns that the AI arms race has us on the road to Armageddon. We believe the Transatlantic Alliance can effectively manage this threat by leading the way towards the development and promulgation of a global doctrine that prioritizes defensive uses and establishes standards for the ethical use of AI. Speaking at a panel organized by the Atlantic Council, Eric Schmidt, the chair of the NSCAI, argued that as China and other adversaries race for technological superiority, a strong alliance among the democratic nations for this techno-economic competition is needed.
AI has so much more to offer, as it harnesses the ability to be used in cybersecurity, tracking public health crises like the COVID-19 pandemic, and the fight against misinformation. However, in light of unlocking the potential of AI, we must take an approach similar to that once stated by famous AI scientist Amit Ray. He states, as more and more artificial intelligence is entering into the world, more and more emotional intelligence must enter into leadership. Gen Z is concerned about the future. Without empathetic and cooperative leadership, we will fall down a spiral of dangerous competition that, if left unregulated, will be weaponized against us. As one of the foremost proponents of internationalism, Kristen Lange once said, technology is a useful servant but a dangerous master. Therefore, it is paramount that we prioritize transatlantic collaboration and cooperation on AI as a means to develop, innovate, and regulate the technology of the future. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. That was the last video from George Washington University debate team, so let's thank them also. They raised 3 cooperation areas for transatlantic cooperation, of course, lithium-ion batteries, cybersecurity, and artificial intelligence. Those are topics which we can discuss over in a workshops coming here in the location, those people who are remaining here. At this point, I would like to thank all the panelists, all the speakers. This morning, we are approaching the conclusion of the broadcasted part of the event, and for people here in person, of course, the fun part starts now, because we are soon entering the workshops under Chatham House rule and really making the world better place, not following the bleak picture of the report. For everybody, as a reminder, the report is downloadable on the website where you live stream this event, or with a QR code here on the location. It's definitely worth reading. So, ladies and gentlemen, this brings us to close of the live stream, the broadcasted session. Thank you very much for everybody online who have been following the event.